Welcome back. Following the panel discussion earlier this morning, we are very pleased to welcome Prof Woollard again to share with us on the topic of science communication, why and how. The Q&A session will be moderated by Prof Lim Teck Ming, Chief Executive of the Science Center Board. Prof Woollard, please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start by saying how brilliant it is to be here and to have met so many of you. And I'm, feel really privileged to have been able to meet people from so many different countries during this week. So I'd like to thank the organisers for giving me the opportunity to come to Singapore and to experience this kind of sharing across such a huge range of different parts of science. So I found it really, really energizing. So I'm going to talk to you today about public engagement and science communication and why I think it's important and how I think to go about doing it. I'm not saying I have all the answers by any means, but I'm going to share my own kind of experience and ideas with you. But I'm going to focus on storytelling and why telling stories is so important in communicating science. And I'm actually going to not just talk about using stories to tell science, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the science of stories as well. Where do they come from? Why do they help us to understand the world so well? And so that's the aim here. So I'm going to start off by the whys of public engagement and science communication. And some of them you're obvious and others a little bit less obvious. But I guess to inspire the next generation of scientists, and I think in the panel this morning we talked a little bit about how this is so important at the moment and how science needs to be done by a very diverse range of individuals across borders, across socioeconomic groups, in order to build up the best knowledge that we can possibly have, and the best way of understanding the world around us. And so sharing this sense of wonder about the world is another really important reason for me. I think that science is very good for my mental health. I know people will tell you that mental health is very bad in scientists and there's so much pressure and everything, but actually going into a lab every day and trying to find out more about the world is an enormous pleasure, privilege and gift, and I think sometimes we sort of forget that. But it's actually, it sustains me so much. Not all just the work I do, but the work that everyone else does as well. So sharing this sense of wonder, that's why we all do science, because we all have questions about the world around us. I also think that science happens because of funding, and a lot of funding is public money that's used. So being open and transparent about how that money is spent is really important. And another thing that we touched on in the panel this morning was why it's important for people to understand the process of science. And this is really important in counteracting mythology and weird ideas that can creep into science, conspiracy theories. Because it's important that people understand that science isn't just you do an experiment and suddenly you understand everything. It's much more complicated than that. It's about building evidence, getting a weight of evidence, and it's iterative, so changing direction sometimes a little bit. You interpret your data because that's the data you have, and it might not be the perfect answer. We're not guardians of the truth. We're guardians of the best evidence available. And then as new evidence becomes available because technology increases, then you might have to modify your original idea. And so, people need to understand that it's not just there's one truth and that's it. It's not really a holy grail in much of what we do. And I think understanding the process, understanding what an experiment is and why it's important to have a proper controlled experiment, at least we would say controlled experiment in my area of research. But recently, people are also using public engagement in some fields to actually influence the research itself. So helping the public involving the public in helping to formulate a research question or a project, and to consult the public on views about their work. And that needs to acknowledge both the wisdom and the sensitivities of the audience around us. So there's much more movement in the area of actually collaborating and co-creating science with members of the public. And so the overall aim is to increase trust. And we talked about trust this morning in the panel. So trust is something that's easily eroded in science. There's lots of examples from the past and also from the present why the MMR vaccine suddenly came under such criticism because apparently it was linked with autism. That turned out to be wrong. Vaccine hesitancy, climate change denial are all areas where trust in science can easily be eroded. So overall, we're increasing trust and we're helping to democratize science. We're helping to make what scientists do more accessible to everybody in society. And so that's part of, I think, negotiating the license that universities and research institutes have to practice science. It's about rebalancing, in some ways, power between institutions and citizens. And so that democratic aspect is something that I'm really interested in. So you'll have learned by now that I use the words science communication and public engagement pretty much interchangeably. But there's subtle differences between the two, and it's worth thinking about them, although I think what I do is both. So the idea is that communication is a bit of a one-way channel of information from the person who knows to the person who doesn't know. And that can be useful in some ways, and it can be disengaging in other ways. And it comes from the idea that there's a deficit in public understanding of science that needs to be filled. Okay? And that can have problems because, you know, some people, they don't see the relevance. They don't understand why it is they need to know this stuff. And that's why engagement can be more powerful, because it's a two-way process. It's about listening as well as talking. It's about seeking views. But of course, that sometimes isn't the right way forward, because you might overestimate the public's willingness to engage in whatever it is you want to engage them with. They might actually want to just receive information sometimes. So that's why I think there's a happy medium between the two, and why I tend to use the terms interchangeably. And then thinking about why now, a bit more about the why, this erosion of trust in science. I think it has not been helped by our politicians of recent years, this trust of science. So the first guy on the left is Michael Gove, who's a British politician. And he got in a lot of trouble for saying that people in this country have had enough of experts. In other words, he was kind of degrading the expertise, and he was saying that opinion is important as well. And that was very problematic in the science community, as you can imagine. And then, of course, we've had Donald Trump, who really hasn't not helped the cause of science either, putting out all sorts of crazy ideas on the internet and beyond. And then I've put a quote in on the right-hand side from Sarah Palin, which most of you won't remember. So Sarah Palin was, excuse me, was the senator for Alaska a few years ago. And she actually ran for vice president alongside Obama and Biden when they actually won the presidential campaign. She was in the opposition. And she started to attack science. So she said, dollars go to projects that have little or nothing to do with the public good. Things like fruit fly research in Paris, France. I kid you not. I'm sure, are there any fruit fly workers in the audience? Yeah, right. So a very unhelpful thing to say. And the community, the model organism community in general, was very quick to get out there with all their examples of how this sort of work has completely revolutionized the ways that we think about biology and indeed medicine. So these are the reasons, I think, why it's really important for scientists to engage, to make sure that these crazy ideas don't get too much airtime. But I think, on the other hand, there's also an opportunity at the moment to capitalize on the scientific response to the pandemic, for example, and the public trust that has been engendered because of that. I think a lot of people's interest in science has shot up during the pandemic because they can see that science offers solutions to global problems that seem insurmountable. You know, the vaccines have dug us out of an enormous hole, and that has increased people's interest and excitement, and I'm being modified here. Is that better? You're happy with that? Oh, good. It's made my voice go much deeper. No, it's very less squeaky. Very interesting. Yeah. So they're all good reasons to communicate your science. But I do think in the panel again, someone made the comment that there weren't many scientists in politics. Well, there weren't many politicians who had been trained in science. Are we good? We're going to have another go. Okay, even lower. Is that better? Are you sure you're happy? Happy? Okay. So I think it would be the world would be a better place if more politicians had a scientific training, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it have made a difference? So to be a bit more serious, though, and I'd like to give you a quote from Carl Sagan, who was a wonderful astronomer and also a science communicator, who I've taken a lot of inspiration from in my own work. And he said, in the way that skepticism is sometimes applied to issues of public concern, there's a tendency to belittle, to condescend, to ignore the fact that, deluded or not, supporters of superstition and pseudoscience are human beings with real feelings, who, like the skeptics, are trying to figure out how the world works and what our role in it might be. Their motives are in many ways consonant with science. If their culture has not given them all the tools they need to pursue this great quest, let us temper our criticism with kindness, because none of us come fully equipped. And I think that's a really good idea to have in your mind when you're communicating with the public. It's not that people are stupid and you're not, and you can tell them what it is they need to know. It's a different contract than that. And we have to understand where people's skepticism and where their disbelief and their alternative belief systems come from if we're to engage with them. So this is a public opinion survey in the UK, Public Attitudes to Science. They're published quite regularly. This one is a little bit old now. But I think the findings would be broadly similar if it was done today. I've actually been involved in one of these surveys very recently, and it's going to be published soon, but I'm not allowed to say anything about it. But the headline is it's in line with this. So 84% of the public agree that science is such a big part of our lives that we should all take an interest. But only 45% feel informed about science and research. So that illustrates the gap that can exist, that we kind of have a good reason to try to plug as scientists. So who are the public? The public are you. The public are the scientists who are in a different field. The public are your children, your colleagues, the people that you went to university with, the people that are going to serve you when you go shopping. They're everybody. They're also policymakers and politicians. And so it's really important to realize that you can have what you think is a public audience, and that they all have exactly the same kind of lack of knowledge. They all have come from the same place, but actually they're hugely diverse, and you never know quite who you're talking to and how what you're saying is going to be interpreted by them. So that's about the public. And then why might you want to get involved in science communication? And I think there's a lot in it for you. It's not all about giving, it's also about receiving. And that's an important part of the contract. So it's about developing your skills. It's about stimulating your creativity often in research and innovation, enriching your career, motivating and inspiring you, gaining new research perspectives. I was talking with David Klenneman just before we came in here about how when you have to try to distill the real kind of nugget of what it is you're doing in order to tell somebody that has no idea about it, actually that's really hard. And that requires you to have a very deep level of understanding about your science. And by going through that process, you can actually gain a deeper understanding and learn more. So I think gaining perspectives is really important. It also might raise your personal and institutional profile. It might allow you to have more influence and networking. You may find new collaborators and new partnerships with people that you never would have thought that you would interact with, scientifically or even around in the communication space. And finally, last but not least, enjoyment and personal reward. So I've said for me, science is good for my mental health. I like the idea of finding out about the world, right? I don't always like the process and the failed experiments and the rejected papers and the rejected grants and all that. That's different. But the aim is something that has a huge amount of joy in it that is great to share with other people. So you can only accompany your public on their voyage of discovery if you've thought really hard about your science and you've worried a lot about the little bits that don't quite fit. And I think that's really important. And don't be afraid of exposing these. Actually, your public audience will love it when you tell them about the bit that doesn't quite fit, or the bit that's missing, the ... You know, people love that kind of journey. They find it absolutely fascinating. So you need to listen to your own explanations, I think. You need to listen to your narrative, find out where the holes are. Think, where is this hard to follow? Always practice talks or podcasts or whatever it is you're doing, conversations, discussions. Find out where the holes are, where the missing beat is. That's really important. And maybe that also might tell you something about where the holes are in your own research. Yeah? And the things that you need to concentrate on in the future. So how can you get involved? And there's an enormous diversity. I mean, I do tend to give a lot of talks, but I'm a bit of a dinosaur. But there's huge things, number of things you can do now. So podcasts, science, comedy. Actually, that's something that I have started doing. It was the one thing I never would have thought I would ever be able to do. And I had a friend who's a comedian, and I said, God, I don't know how you do what you do. I'd never be able to be a comedian, do anything remotely funny, ever. And they said, well, that's obviously the thing that you need to try next. And I did, and actually, I love it. I find it amazing to talk about science and from a comedy point of view. Engage people by talking about your project in all the kind of craziness that... I mean, I work on nematode worms, right, that are tiny and hermaphrodite, so that they're females that produce their own sperm. And that is comedy gold, I can tell you, But in amongst that comedy and those laughs, and you can get your message across in a very different way to a very different audience. So, do have a go at that. So games, science festivals. This is a DNA acrobats at the Crick Institute. So all sorts of different things. You don't have to go out and give talks. There's lots and lots of things that you can do. Writing, being a volunteer at a festival, doing things in teams so that it's easier. But I was just going to say a little bit about the Royal Institution and the Christmas lectures, because that was my kind of first major foray into doing something really, really public, like making a TV show. And it was the most extraordinary experience. I don't know if any of you know about the Royal Institution in London, but it's basically a sort of centre for public understanding of science. And it was an institution that did research of its own until fairly recently, but it's always had a very strong public science thread. And now it's really only devoted to public understanding and public engagement with science. And the public engagement thread and arm of Royal Institution was set up by Michael Faraday. So Michael Faraday discovered the concept of electromagnetism, and his work was the foundation of the electric motor and practical uses of electricity. So you can see immediately that has revolutionized our world. It's hard to think of anything that has done more than electricity, commonly used for our civilization and our society. But Michael Faraday had almost no formal education. He came from a very poor family. Excuse me. He left school at 16. He became an apprentice to a bookbinder. And it was as an apprentice to a bookbinder that he started to read, because there were books everywhere. And that's how he became interested in science, and he educated himself in science. And then he got an apprenticeship to Sir Humphrey Davy, who was working in the Royal Institution and was starting to work on problems like electromagnetism. But it was Faraday that really sorted a lot of that stuff out. And Faraday felt very strongly all the way through that there's no point doing any of this unless you tell people about it. And so he started the Royal Institution Lectures in 1825. And they were so popular in Victorian London that the street that the Royal Institution is on is called Albemarle Street. And that's the first one-way street, because there were so many carriages coming to Albemarle Street to hear these lectures that there was massive traffic jams and nobody could move for hours. And so they decided to set up a one-way flow of traffic in order to avoid the traffic jams. So that's how popular science communication was in the 1820s. There was so much going on in science that people wanted to find out more about it. So I was incredibly privileged to find myself delivering these lectures in 2013, and it was a huge, important experience for me, and it started that kind of aspect of my working life off, I suppose, in a much bigger and more impactful way. And it's a very different way when you're doing a TV production, though. It's a very different team involved. So these are the sorts of lists of the people that were involved in putting those programs together. So the Royal Institution Christmas Lectures have to involve a lot of demonstrations and experiments. And there's meant to be like one demonstration every 2 minutes, which is quite daunting when you think that you've got to put 3 60-minute lectures together. And so some of the props that we used are on the right-hand side there. And all of these people involved, from the BBC, from, I had no idea. I didn't even know what a script supervisor or a floor supervisor was in TV production, but I kind of learnt a lot of these things along the way. So that was an amazing experience. And of course, you also work with a script. You have to write the script to start with, but then it gets taken over, and the crew decides, all these things, like we had worm cam TV involved, which I found was a very funny concept at the time, to look at our C. elegans worms on TV. So I'm going to summarize this part of my talk then by saying that with my top tips for communicating your science, and they're in no particular order, but the first one I think is really important. Don't just talk, listen. So listen to your audience. Try and find out about them beforehand if possible, but listen to what they tell you. Listen to their stories, because that's where they're coming to your science with their own experience, and it's important for you to know that when you interact with them. Work out what you're good at and do that. Yeah? Don't make yourself give lots of loads of talks if actually you really hate doing that, although it does get easier over time, and you do need to practice. And every scientist needs to be able to give a decent talk at some stage or other in their career. So I would say do try and talk to people, give talks. But when you first start, you can volunteer, you can make a team, you don't have to do everything on your own. Don't just do it to tick a box, right? You do it because you think it's a really important part of your work. Don't say, well, I've got to do some public engagement, otherwise, I don't know, my boss is going to be upset with me, so I'm going to do this and get it out of the way, because that means that the quality won't be so good. And the final thing that I want to say is that the really, really good science communication is all about telling stories. And when we've heard all of the amazing talks this week, that's what they've been. They've been great stories. They kind of had a plot line, and we've followed them, and we've become involved in that story and want to know what happens next. Because all of the speakers this week have been really great communicators. So I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about stories now. So we share our science by telling stories. At least that's when it works best. But what is the science of storytelling? Where do stories come from? And why are they so important? So we all love a good story. I finished a novel last night, too late actually, because I should have been asleep. And I felt really empty at the end of it, because I finished it. And I'm like, well, what am I going to do now? I don't know what, I've got to wait till I get back to the airport and buy another book to read. So we all love a good story. I think following a story actually exercises our neurons in much the same way as learning does. And neuroscientists will tell you that. So we're tuned into stories. But where do they come from, and why is storytelling so useful for science? So we can look around the biological world and we can find some storytelling, actually. So these are social insects. They're communities with very few conflicts of interest. Okay, that's really important in why their stories work so well. So this is the waggle dance. I don't know if any of you know, some of you probably know more about the waggle dance than I am, because I don't work on social insects. But it's a dance that gives information about sources of food. So it tells you about the direction of the food, and it tells you how far away it is. So it's quite sophisticated information. And you can see how these sorts of elaborate behavioral signaling systems can evolve in the social insects, because there's no conflict, especially there's no sexual conflict. So communities of social insects are sterile workers, like these bees. So the interest of the workers then is to feed and raise the nests, the brood, and not to reproduce by themselves. It's all about the queen. So cheating, finding the food and keeping it all for yourself is pointless. Cheating your sister would be just like cheating yourself. And that stability, that lack of conflict, means that the waggle dance can become more sophisticated and over evolution. So it's thought to be around 20 million years old, the waggle dance. And it's like a story because it enables others to experience something and learn from it, okay? But this stability means that it has a chance to evolve ever more elaborate routines. But it's storytelling in the biological world. And we can find another one in the primates. So there's a great experiment done by Emil Menzel some years ago. And I find this really a real great bit of storytelling among the primates. And, sorry. The experiment was to hide food in the enclosure of these chimpanzees and only show the hiding place to one of them. And the primate that was chosen to be shown where the food was called Belle. And Belle was very warm-hearted, a very warm-hearted chimp, but diminutive. And when all the chimps were let back into the enclosure, Belle immediately got the food and she shared it with everybody. And then as they repeated the experiment, so the results changed, because another chimp called Rock, and Rock was more of a bruiser, okay? Rock decided that he was going to wait until Belle showed everyone where the food was, and then he would take the food and have it all for himself. He didn't want to share, right? And so what Belle did was she stopped showing Rock where the food was, or she stopped showing anyone where the food was when Rock was around, okay? In fact, what she did was she sat on it and she kept it concealed. But Rock, well, he wised up to this, okay? And he started shoving Belle out of the way so that he could see what she was sitting on, because there was the food. And then Belle, she wised up to this. So she thought, not having this. So I'm going to sit away from the food, cause a kind of decoy, and that Rock won't know where the food is. So what did Rock do? Well, he started peeping over his shoulder to see where Belle was, because she moved when she thought that he wasn't looking. So this conflict of interest then over food has led to an arms race of deception and counter-deception in this story, in the story that the primates were telling each other. So, and the arms race acts as a huge accelerator for intelligence, okay? In this particular case, the experiment has led to the suggestion that the increase in brain size and intelligence in primates was driven more by the need to deal with the complexity of social interactions, actually, than by the need to make tools, for example. And it's known as the Machiavellian Intelligence hypothesis. So then, two nice examples of storytelling in the world around us. But what about us? So in humans, how long has storytelling been a thing? And it turns out that we've been telling stories ever since we developed language, because they're a way of making sense of the world. We've been telling stories in one form or another for tens of thousands of years, and they probably predate the cave paintings. So this cave painting here is thought to be about 40,000 years old. So because they're so ancient, we're evolutionarily tuned to them. But why did we start telling them? Because we want to share knowledge. We want to make sense of the world. And that's very pertinent to science. We'll come back to that later. So the bees pass knowledge on with the waggle dance, but it's slow. It requires great social stability and cooperation and huge evolutionary time. Primates pass knowledge on, but in a limited and more primitive way. But we humans, we use language, and that's the big difference. We use language to share knowledge, and that's super fast in the form of stories. So storytelling and learning are fundamentally connected. Stories tap into our neural learning mechanisms. So why did we start telling them then? Before I go on to that, I'm going to say actually the story is a two-headed beast. Stories can be both positive and negative. They can inform, share, educate, engage, entertain, but they can also deceive, mislead, conceal, manipulate. Stories can both inform on the one hand and deceive on the other. So you remember the arms race in behavior between bell and rock. There's also an arms race in storytelling between truth and deception. And this is going to turn out to be really important when we think about the origins of science. Because the scientific method seeks to resolve the conflict between truth and falsity. And we'll come back to this. But just to start with some very early stories, human stories were probably honest, and they were probably around altruistic acts. So here we have, this is bear coming, follow me, right? The problem, the bear, the resolution, I'm running away. If you want to follow me, you might get away from the bear. So storytelling didn't need sophisticated language and great intelligence, and it may have been established among close kin, because then it would be more favored by natural selection. But as soon as you have this kind of honest signaling, you have scope for dishonest signaling. Come into my cave. There's a bear coming. Or maybe not. So you need to be able to spot the deception, okay? And what are the strategies to spot this deception? Well, empirical contradiction has to be the best one. There's no bear comes. The story is false. It doesn't work. Okay? Maybe the female becomes less trusting of that male in the future. So evidence mounts against the veracity of the story. Maybe that fact is then shared. What about if she shares her knowledge with others? The male the caveman may acquire a reputation. There's potentially a cost to his lie. So lies can be detected through self-contradiction, through empirical contradiction or through self-contradiction. Okay? You might ask for help, promising to return the favor later on, but then you refuse to help in return. So the person who helped you is going to feel deceived and trust you less. So the better you can detect the deceit, the more of an evolutionary advantage you might have. Okay? So the stories need to get better, more convincing. And then the lies need to get better, more convincing. And so there's an arms race between truth and deception, but this time in storytelling. So through the use of language rather than through behavior. So the Machiavellian intelligence then works at a new level, not just on behavior, but on what is being said. So the process depends then on a balance between trust and distrust. Too much trust and liars will get away with murder. Too little trust, or too much distrust, and there's no need to communicate at all. Nobody says anything. But with each held in check through the storytelling arms race, intelligence grows. So the two-headed nature of stories, to inform on the one hand, to deceive on the other, may have been a key driver in the evolution of human intelligence. Eventually, storytelling gets very sophisticated. It evolves into fiction, which conveys truth through an imaginary chain of events. So gradually, the causal chains then in stories become more elaborate and become more engaging. You end up with great fiction. We may learn from the stories and be entertained. Good stories may make us wiser. They may help us construct our world. And by following the story, we're taken on a journey, and our neural models may be modified as a result. But isn't that the opposite of science, that concerns itself with worldly observations? According to J.B.S. Haldane, science begins with doubt. So Copernicus doubted that the sun went around the Earth. He had a theory to replace the old one, And his observations and experiments were largely designed to support that theory. But as time went on, this theory too was found wanting. Planets don't go around the sun in perfect circles. Gravity is much more complex than that. So scientists look for contradictions. If a contradiction is found, then a better explanation is needed. So the tools then that scientists use, seeking empirical or logical contradictions, are the very same as those used to detect lies. Now, that doesn't, of course, mean that the false hypothesis is meant to deceive in science. It isn't. It may simply be the best explanation of the available data. So through stories, then, we honed our skills in causal reasoning and finding contradictions in working out whether someone was speaking the truth or not. And in science, we apply those skills to stories about the natural world. If we were as honest as the honeybees with no drive to deceive, then there'd be no room for doubt. We would just accept. But we're storytelling animals. Through stories, we honed our skills in this way. Not going on very well. So science was born then when skills developed to detect contradictions in stories. Science was born when skills which we developed to detect contradictions in stories were applied to our sayings about the world, so as to get closer to the truth. So in sharing their knowledge, then, scientists invite constant checking and refining, sometimes even turning a hypothesis on its head. And this culture of honest investigation, then, with nature as the ultimate arbiter, allowed science to make rapid progress. This is just one view of the science timeline, just to show you how rapid progress can be. I think it's no coincidence that the motto of the Royal Society, which is the Science Academy in the UK, is nullius in verba, which is Latin for take nobody's word for it. So we employ storytelling principles, so detecting contradictions in science. And what we've developed over evolution then is this remarkable storytelling lie detector. And then we found that we could use this to arrive at other truths. But storytelling doesn't just provide the basic skills and motivations for science, as I've told you about. It provides the mechanisms for scientists to share knowledge. And so in the last few minutes, I'm just going to tell you about how to construct your science into a story. So why do stories work for science? Well, they hold our attention. Nobody would listen if a string of facts were just read out. And the craft of the story is the thing that makes us want to know more. And we get the chance to experience things that have never happened to us, problems we'd never thought about before. I've thought about a lot of problems I've never thought about before in science by being here and listening to the amazing talks. We pay attention because they might be useful later on. They also help with recall and comprehension. So researchers have shown that that recall of a list of random nouns is improved 6 to 7-fold when they're woven into a story. It's very hard to remember a list, but it's very easy to remember a story. Now, science is actually full of stories, and we touched on this a little bit in the panel this morning. The stories in science are the results, but they're also hope and passion and commitment. Often the stories are left out, actually, and I think sometimes science maybe is a little bit the worse for it. It would be better if we brought more of the story into our science. It's very hard to do in the written paper. I don't know about you, but my heart always sinks when my colleagues ask me to read their papers and comment on them. I think, what, the whole paper? From start to finish? You know, it can be a bit of a task. But, you know, I do it because they're my colleagues and I love them. But sometimes they can be quite boring. And if a little bit more of this story was there, a little bit more of the motivation, the context, the whys, the how we got to where we got, I think actually it would be better. But it's very easy to put that kind of material into a talk or a podcast or some other communication. So how do you tell a great story? So most stories have the same structure, and most stories are about someone trying to achieve something. So there's setup, there's conflict, and there's resolution. That's the basic storytelling idea. So the setup is of a story is the background, the character's life, what initiates them working towards their goal. Or in science, what's the problem in science that you're trying to address? Why is that interesting? The conflict, the middle of the story, the tension, what's stopping them from realizing their goal? In science, you know, what's your approach? Why is this difficult? What challenges did you need to overcome? And then the resolution, the wrap-up, could be a denouement. What did you find? Why did that change the way we think or add to the data or, you know, just crystallize this area of science a little bit more? Cause and effect is really important in a great story. Something happens which triggers the next thing, which triggers the next thing. So logical flow really helps our brains, right? It's really important in a science story that things don't seem to happen at random. Our brains hate that. They find it very difficult to compute. So there's lots of ways of telling a story. There's words, there's text, there's imagery. What you're doing is you're making a movie inside your audience's head, okay? And it's actually very similar to the structure that Disney used. So this is, if you go, this is actually from someone I met who works for Disney and is a screenwriter. And this is how they write. They call it Pixar's story spine, but it's actually stolen from other ideas about storytelling. And it's called Freytag's pyramid. So there's the exposition, there's some sort of inciting incident, there's the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution. So you can see exactly the same structure. So whenever you write a screenplay for a Disney movie, you have to use this structure, these paragraphs. Once upon a time, blah, 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 blah. Every day, blah, blah, blah. Until one day, blah, blah, blah. Because of that, blah, 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 blah. And because of that, everyone lived happily ever after. And that's the structure that everybody at Disney has to use. So I thought that was a very interesting kind of analogy. So what about your story then? What story do you want to tell? How do you find the story in your work? And it can be quite difficult. I find a really useful tool is to play but why. But you need a friend to play but why with. It's a bit daft if you do it on your own. But with your colleagues, it's about explaining your work in one sentence. And then what your partner does is they pick one word or phrase and attach it to but why. And they keep going. So here's an example, right? I research proteins that build up in the brain and can cause Alzheimer's disease. I don't actually, but I thought I'd take the perspective of someone who did. But why? Well, Alzheimer's, why Alzheimer's? Because Alzheimer's is just such a common disease and it has such an impact on people's lives. But why can it have such an impact on people's lives? Well, because it affects your memory. And that's so important to who you are. But why is memory so important? Because our lives are shaped by memories, and losing them is like losing a part of yourself, and so on. But why, but why, but why, but why? And that is the thing that distills out the story. The other thing you need to do when you're putting your story together is to think about your audience. Define them. Who are they? What's your message? What do you want to gain from this? What do you think they want to gain from this? How do you use language? How do you avoid jargon? What does your audience really need in order to understand your story? What's the nuggets that they need to link the concepts together? Okay? And that's vital, because you could tell a different story depending on the audience and the message that you want to give. So you cut away the unnecessary detail. Okay? And then you need a good hook. You need a way to get people involved right at the beginning. Start with a hook. Keep the suspense. In biology, which is my field, it's often a beautiful image. Images are so helpful in the biological sciences and in others, in physics, in astronomy as well. Okay? Because the scene that you can create compels viewers to ask, what's going on here? Who are these people? Who are these animals? What is this a picture of? And what do they want? So it's no accident that films often start with a frenetic, action-packed scene, like in this James Bond movie. Often, actually, the scene doesn't really have that much to do with the rest of the story, but it actually gets you really involved in watching it. Huh? In your science story, it's much more that the hook is the big picture, that maybe your work doesn't quite answer, because it could be a really big question in biology, but it would be a way of illustrating that. And then in a written paper, I've just got the beginning of Watson and Crick's paper on DNA structure, and I love the way that they start that. We wish to suggest a structure for the salt of deoxyribonucleic acid. This structure has novel features which are of considerable biological interest. No kidding, right? Bit of an understatement, but a very effective tool in that particular story. So that's how you start. And then you have to take your audience on a journey. I think metaphors and analogies can be useful. I think making it personal is really useful. And I think carefully about the ending. Well, what's the message? What's the feeling? Do you need to sum up? You need a strong finish. How do you take people to the end of your story with you? And I've just got two really nice endings. One is from Darwin's Origin of Species. And he ends by saying, "There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." I know that he was doing something quite profound in his book, and maybe sometimes your research doesn't feel that profound, but if you can end strong, I think it really helps. And then the end of the Watson and Crick paper, I think, is a good example of understatement, which is really effective, actually. It's not escaped our notice that the specific pairing we have postulated immediately suggests a powerful, I can't actually read this, a possible copying mechanism for the genetic material, right? It ends you wanting to know more. It's a real denouement at the end of that story. So I've got to the end of what I want to say. I've suggested then that a major contributing factor to the evolution of human language and intelligence was an arms race between truth and deception in storytelling. And that also was a process that's critical for establishing our abilities and our motivations to do science. So biologically speaking, I think there's very little to distinguish our brains from those of our cave-dwelling ancestors, but storytelling has undergone a kind of runaway evolution through cultural processes and the technologies that go with that. So printing and travel and the internet. Stories inhabit every part of our lives. So storytelling has allowed human intelligence to become a collective intelligence. And that operates not only in the present, but it reaches into the future and it reaches into the past, because like DNA, the stories are passed on from one generation to the next. So I think the challenge for the future then will be to ensure that the stories based on the values of honesty, doubt, evidence, and reason, and which lie at the heart of science, are more powerful and effective than those based on deception, the fake news, and the conspiracy theories. But if we all work with the storytelling principles of detecting logical or empirical contradictions, I think they will be. So, thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Woollard. We now invite Prof. Lim to moderate the Q&A.
Thank you. Right. Pick up an yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Alison. I certainly learned a lot from you. I like the way you put the science of story and story of science into this lecture. And I think all of our audience here must have learned a lot, just like I had. And I agree with them, I'm sure, that the tips that you give will be very helpful for them, especially when they develop a career in telling the wonder of the science that they work on. I'd like to start off first by my own personal question, because you were among a few that were selected to present in the Faraday Lecture Hall, the Royal Institution Christmas Lecture. And you give us a hint of how much is involved in that. Can you just enlighten us? Because among here, some of them might be the future lecture for Christmas series in Faraday. Did you have to apply for it, or you were in a way selected? Because I understand there's a long process behind, and were there auditions, for example?
That's actually I don't know if oh yes, it is working. That's actually quite a funny story, because I got an email from the Royal Institution saying, we think that you might be a good candidate for the Christmas lectures, and would you like to just give us a little paragraph about what your lectures might be on, if they're in the area of genetics, developmental biology sort of thing. And I actually thought that that was a joke. I thought, I get a lot of emails from, oh, will you do this, or speak at this conference that's nothing to do with your research area or whatever, and I just skim through these emails and I kind of ignore a lot of them. So I didn't read it properly, was the answer. And then a couple of weeks later, they emailed me again, And they said, most people really reply to this email very quickly. Say yes, please. So, have you just missed it or whatever? And at that point, I read it properly and I thought, oh my God, this is big potatoes. So then I did get in touch with them and I wrote a paragraph. I remember I was at a scientific conference at the time and I told my colleagues, I've written this paragraph about potentially giving the Christmas lectures, and they're like, what? No way! And it all went from there. So I had to do a screen test, audition type thing, it went from there. Yeah.
Right. And we had the privilege of having you here in Singapore.
Yeah.
In fact, she was invited by A-Star and us, the Science Centre, Singapore, to deliver her version of the Christmas lecture in London, in Singapore at that time, because we were sponsored by A-Star. It was called the Star Lecture. And if you're interested in her talk, we still have the DVD and the link. Right.
And the Christmas lectures come here every year, so they'll be coming in the summer.
Yeah,
the
right.
New ones, yeah.
Okay, and I like the way you put it, that storytelling is falsifying the lies and verifying the truth. And I can see the parallel in that, because I think many of us, when we do research, we always have got this hypothesis testing. And as a young scientist, when we started learning to do science research, we were told how to falsify and reject hypotheses. So is that also a way of doing not just science itself, but in terms of science communication and when you deal with so-called, I don't know whether you've been engaged by journalists to ask you to verify and probably comment on certain...
Yeah, it can be a good way to communicate, because it goes along the lines of, well, it could be this, but actually it was shown not to be this. So then it could be this, but it's shown not to be this. So then it's this, and this is the thing that the idea that stands the test of time, which is how we sort of determine the best explanations for processes in the world at the moment. The one that lasts the longest before it's kind of thrown down as a heap of junk and replaced by something else. So yeah, I think it can work very well to communicate.
Right, and you also alluded to the point that science communication is a one-way thing, and people are now moving more towards the science engagement part. There is a question here. I tried to put it up, but it doesn't seem to go up. But anyway, I'll read it out from here. Before that, I should give this comment. This is the best presentation about science communication that I ever heard. Somebody say that. So thank you for inspiring them. Okay, thank you. Right. So that's a great comment. Thank you from Rutai Con Street. Okay. There is one comment here about there's a trend. This person who sent in anonymously say that at least in computer science, that a paper tells a fancy story but lacks solid foundation for it. What's your view on such a trend? I don't know whether this trend is really a pervasive trend. Have you come across trends like this?
Oh yeah, we would call that triumph of spin over substance. Okay. Yeah, very common. There is a tendency for scientists to kind of hyperbolize their work because they want to get the grant, they want to get the paper in a high-impact journal. There's all that pressure going on. And it's a problem because it then gets very hard to detect not the lie. I'm not saying that any of this is falsified in any way, but maybe that's not the most important gene in that pathway that they've discovered. Maybe there are other things that are more important. So I do think that it's beholden on all of us to have some sense of reality and self-criticism about the importance of our work, because that means it will stand the test of time much better, and it's about the picture emerging of how the world works accurately. But we're not going to solve the problem of competition in science here, I don't think.
Right. Okay. I thought this would be very appropriate for you to give advice to. If somebody is shy, introverted, how can they communicate?
Yeah, practice helps a lot. I think I'm actually quite shy and introverted. some of you might doubt that, but actually I think it's true. And I think a lot of scientists that give amazing talks are really shy and introverted. You know, I don't think scientists are the best collection of extroverts.
So it's good to see that we have people who are non-shy and they are stepping forward. So shall we start with you?
Oh, hi. I study physics, but I have never done any serious science communication beyond trying to explain quantum mechanics to my family, which, you know, is already challenging enough. So,
yeah, that's quite serious, I would say.
So the question is that are there or should there be a system of regulations on science communicators to prove whether or not they qualify to do it? Because I see that basically everyone can be one by setting up an account and start posting. So there can be irresponsible scientific communication.
Yeah, right.
It'd be very hard to imagine a kind of licensing system, wouldn't it? And maybe that wouldn't be very inclusive. I kind of think the community kind of is quite self-regulating. So if somebody rises to prominence by talking a load of nonsense on Twitter or whatever, it tends to get regulated by other scientists saying, no, this is wrong because of X, Y, and Z. So I do think there's an awful lot of self-regulation that goes on.
Yep.
Maybe sometimes it's not, because in my country, there are lots of cases there it just went unregulated. Famous people just do irresponsible communication.
Right, yeah. Well, so, it can happen, yeah.
Yes, and we have to stand up as scientists to tell the truth. Please,
Hi, Prof. Thank you so much for the very engaging presentation. My question actually goes back to more of the start of your presentation when you mentioned about outreach and like comedy and stuff. So in my opinion, I feel that some fields lend themselves better to comedy and outreach and engagement than others. What would be your comment on this? And also, like, what do you think scientists in like not so relatable fields can do to better engage the public about their research? Thank you.
I mean, I've been to quite a lot of science comedy things now, and I've even been a judge on this thing called Fame Lab, which is when PhD students have 3 minutes to present their thesis in a funny way. And I'm always amazed by how you can use that platform for any kind of science. And it might sound incredibly dull when you look at the title. And I'm always blown away because I'm roaring with laughter in the first minute or so, you know. And I find it a really, really good way to learn about new fields that I have no idea about. So I wouldn't say your work is either funny or it isn't. You've got to find the amusing story in that. And it might be about your experiences as a human being working in that field where that sort of rich story is.
Yep.
Yeah?
The next, right. We have 2.5 minutes, so got to be quick.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. I can see how storytelling can be used on trying to convey our work. But I'm interested on the scenario when the storytelling doesn't work anymore. Let's say, for example, you have mentioned conspiracy theories. Maybe specifically, one example are flat earthers. So despite the empirical and logical contradictions, their beliefs there still persist. Do you think, as science communicators, should we continue to engage them? Do we have to change our strategy on them, or are they a lost cause?
Yeah.
And when you mentioned about the evolutionary advantage of trying to detect lies, would you say that evolution has failed them?
Well, it's early days for conspiracy theories, I think.
Yeah.
I think the problem is that there's a political motive for some of these conspiracy theories, and that it's not just about a debate about the science, it's much more than that. And part of it is understanding where that comes from. So why are these conspiracy theorists, why have they got these weird ideas about vaccines or whatever? And do I try to engage with them in a different way because of that? And part of it is, I think, quite relentlessly putting out the right evidence-based facts. And I think it's exhausting. But I'm thinking around vaccine hesitancy I think there's been a lot of work. I have a friend who's who did a lot of volunteering in Oxford in the vaccines for COVID. And people came who were really, really scared of being vaccinated and were really on the point of walking away, because they'd heard all these stories. And so she relentlessly sat them down and talked to them and told them, shared with them the evidence and the stories there. And often it worked. But it's relentless and exhausting, and you have to keep doing it. But I think that's important. We have to do that as scientists.
Thank you.
Right, the clock is counting down. It's 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 now. I was told to just have to stop it, so I apologize for not having you to ask the question. So exactly on the dot, 0.00.00. Alison, thank you so much. I learned a lot from you. I'm sure many of them will want to continue to engage you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof Woollard and Prof Lim, for the discussion. We will now proceed with the next plenary lecture. Our next speaker is Sir Konstantin Novoselov, and the topic that he'll be sharing today would be materials for the future. The Q&A session will be moderated by Dr. Yang Le. I will now hand the session over to Sir Konstantin, please. Thank you. Let's welcome Sir Konstantin, please.
Do you go straight? Or? Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. So it's really a pleasure to be here, and it's well, over the last 3 days, and it's really an exciting opportunity for everyone, not only for you, but also for ourselves to interact and try to present something for general audience. I presume there are not that many, hopefully not that many experts who are going to criticize our recent work. So I can tell you not completely true story now, just so just make it nice and beautiful pictures. Anyway, so I'll try to talk a bit about the work which we do now. How do we see the future of material research? I'm a physicist by training, but increasingly I work on materials, and well, we just I'll try to structure the presentation in two parts. So what do we have right now, and how can we go, and what can we expect from this area in the future? So, and the easiest way, surprise, surprise, is to start with graphene. I'm sure that many of you do know this material. It's the thinnest possible material. It's actually a very simple material as well, consists only of carbon atoms in a two-dimensional setting in a honeycomb lattice, but yet it's actually the same this very lattice, which gives it very interesting properties, because the honeycomb lattice it's actually not one of those simple Brave lattices. It has 2 atoms per unit cell. So a lattice, a crystal, is something when you take an atom or a unit cell, and then you can replicate it in space simply by translating it by certain unit vectors. So here, graphene, actually, you need 2 atoms. So here I colored them red and green, even though we all know that carbon atoms are blue, of course. And then you need 2 of them to create a honeycomb lattice, which gives, and then you need to quantum mechanically allow your electron to sit on both atoms simultaneously, which gives you this so-called bonding anti-bonding state, which result in the famous Dirac cones linear dispersion relations, which you usually observe only for relativistic particles. So I'm not going to go into details, into equations and so on, just give you one example, what kind of unusual properties can you expect from such a material. Like many of you would realize that if you run a car into a wall, you would most probably crash it, right? So that's the common wisdom. Now, in quantum mechanics, there is an effect called tunneling, quantum tunneling, which gives you a tiny probability to go through this wall. So the probability is very tiny. Don't try it neither with Mercedes nor with Volkswagen. Really doesn't matter. So it's pretty much 0 for the non-quantum object, but actually in electronic world we deal with this quantum tunneling all the time, and it's really one of the biggest problem for modern transistors. As transistors become smaller and smaller, quantum tunneling gives you a lot of leakage current, so that's why your microprocessors overheat all the time. Now, for relativistic particles, and including those electrons in graphene, the situation is such that you can go through this wall without any problem, with 100% probability. It's something which we see in our experiments every day. So it just shows how unusual the electronic properties and optical and many other properties of this material are, and that's the reason why lots of people work on it, including those who try to use it for electronics, for optoelectronics, and so on. So, and generally, there are many other unique properties with this material. It's the thinnest possible material, the stretchable, the most impermeable, conductive, thermally conductive, so on, so on, so on. And then that's the reason why it has been used and tested for many different applications, from energy to composites, from sensor to printable electronic. So, but before I go into the applications, just let me, and promising you what kind of graphene world you will see in the future, let me just give you a few examples of what graphene has done for us already. One thing, it created workplaces, quite a lot actually, and some of our students opened some spin-off companies, and some become rich, some become poor actually with those. But so it was meant as a joke, but until a few years ago I received my regular copy of the Glamour magazine, and on one of the pages you read 5 jobs our kids will be doing, and it's right next to virtual architect, avatar stylist, and active makeup developer, there is a graphene engineer. So if said by Glamour, must be true, right? So then it also provides entertainment. I'm sure that in this audience, I don't need to advertise this sitcom. And so for those who don't know, The Big Bang Theory, so they discontinued this, but it was very popular sitcom about 4 postdocs from Caltech who were just one of them, the main character, probably the string theorist Sheldon, and then in one of the episodes alone, he was trying to figure out why electrons in graphene behave as massless quasi-relativistic particles. You all know this already. It's because of the honeycomb lattice. It took him the whole episode because some of the formulas on those whiteboards are actually wrong. So that's they are for bilayer graphene, they're not for monolayer graphene. So, and then, so it also gives shout, if you ever fancy to go and live in Tallahassee, Florida, you can live on graphene lane there. But generally, so when coming to applications, surprisingly, I mean, for us, graphene is very special material. When it goes to application, it follows the footstep of pretty much every single advanced material before it. So it starts from the composite materials, where you can ask huge premium for tiny improvement of the properties. So usually in the sport goods, ourselves we collaborated with McLaren and Richard Miller to create this world lightest, unfortunately world most expensive watch, definitely most expensive per gram. It's 1 million Swiss per 32 grams, but well, it works. If you haven't got 1 million Swiss, you can spend $250,000 on this car, and this is becoming real. So it's a small manufacturer nearby Liverpool, and they produce these BAC mono cars, and they use graphene panels for their composites, not for the sake of the lightness or the strength, but primarily because of the thermal conductivity, which gives you faster production rate. And then, but you don't actually need to go for those. So these days, every single Ford car would use graphene under its bonnet, again for some strange noise canceling, noise absorption properties. So, and then if you go for electronics, again, every thsingle Huawei phone would use graphene for thermal management. No any other material can give you more than 1,000 meter Kelvin thermal conductivity. And then I don't want to go into details into electronics and optoelectronics, which is becoming quite popular and being developed right now. So for some time there was a question about the production of this material, because we started a long time ago with so-called Scotch tape method. You basically take a piece of graphite and cleave it with Scotch tape. And I should admit, we still use it. We still use the same method up to now in our labs. Just Scotch becomes slightly better, but that's it. So just still the same method. But for the industrial production, there are many other ways how to produce graphene. Say for electronic grades, you would use CVD, chemical vapor deposition, where you run carbon-containing gas on top of a surface of a hot metal, and then this gas cracks on the surface, hydrogen flies away. It's a way to produce hydrogen, actually, and then carbon rearranges itself into in graphene. And the beauty of this method is that you can use pretty much anything, any carbon-containing species. So, for example, when we needed to produce iron-doped graphene, so for some quantum measurements, what you do, you just use this. You simply prick your finger, spread it on copper, stick it into the furnace, and that's it. So you got your graphene. So for anyone looking for a job, so we still hiring for these sort of experiments, but don't worry, those fingers are mine. So no students were hurt during during those experiments. Anyway, and there are a few other ways as well how to produce this material. But then the story continues when you say, look, if you get such interesting results simply using your lead pencils, if you invest a little bit and buy some other pencils, can you do something else? The answer is yes, you can. So you can actually produce many other two-dimensional materials, and these days there are so many of them, there are many dozens of them, and they cover a huge range of properties from, say, the most insulating to the most conductive, ferromagnetic, superconductors, so just anything you want. And that actually gives us a very unique opportunity. Just let me step aside a little bit from my story and just try to explain you what kind of and why do we need those opportunities. So generally, of course, materials are extremely important for us. We even call the ages we live in by the names of the dominant materials, right? The Stone Age, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age. The good question is which age do we live in now? And it's probably for the first time that we have a choice now, right? You can call it a digital age or silicon or maybe even nuclear if you want. So we have a choice, and probably we need to really to make a very smart choice. So we start to get quite a diversity in and adaptivity in terms of custom engineering. So we can draw something on a piece of paper or on your computer and then 3D print it immediately. Or we start to do it. We start to do the same with chemicals as well, right? So you can order DNAs really just from your office, and then a few weeks later you will receive it in a vial. Now, can we do the same with materials as well? So why would we need it? So here is an example from electronic technology. So the electronic technology stick with one material, silicon, for more than for 70 years now, right? So, and in principle, everything was going quite well. So it's a very simple, very robust technology. So we can produce very interesting structures which actually do work, and that's great. So, and it was indeed very simple until 1990. So those are the elements which we use in silicon technology. So it's silicon, boron, phosphorus for doping, right? Aluminium for interconnects, hydrogen, oxygen for passivation. Very, very, very basic technology. So then, after 1990, we needed more denser transistors. We need to have better interconnects. So we used copper. You start to use copper, you need some diffusion barriers, work function matching materials, but still manageable technology. So these days, because we stick with one material and we keep adapting and changing it to the new requirements, we use more than half of the periodic table for our silicon technology. So it's actually quite bizarre, because if you compare how many materials, how many elements can you find in your body, there are more elements which we use in silicon technology than you find in your own body. And you would agree with me that human body is much more versatile and adaptive than modern electronics. So, and that's generally the case. We really still from the Stone Age, we use only few materials, surprisingly few materials in our technology. So all our electronics is silicon. Construction, we depend on the strength of steel, really. For aerospace, aluminum, until recently. So we basically become slaves of those materials. So we just, if you want to make something, to create a new device, the engineer should first check what's the silicon bandgap, what's the work function of silicon, what's the bandgap of silicon oxide, and then design this device within those constraints. Ideally, of course, you don't want this. You want to design freely and then find a suitable material for it. And we do this with the so-called composite materials or heterostructures, and they do indeed exist. We do use it, but only really few and far between. Ideally, you would like to have this opportunity to build materials by atom, or at least layer by layer engineering, and then program, okay, I want my top layer to be a sensor, then to be like a power supply, the next few layers, a logic or interconnects or whatever. And now we have this opportunity with the 2D materials, because when I come to lab, I have all those one atom thick crystals available to me. So what I can do now, of course, we study their properties individually, but what I can also do, I can combine them in a manner Mother Nature never intended it to be, and then I can create really new structures. So we call them van der Waals heterostructures, and I really can program their properties with very, very high, with atomic precision and with fantastic flexibility, because I have so many of those materials. And indeed, many new devices, many new physical effects have been demonstrated with those. So this is probably one of the most complex material which we created, but then you just apply voltage and then it gives you light in return. So it's an LED, and because we have so many of them, so we have we can change parameters in a wide range. Now, just to show you one example how versatile is technology, so and how flexible and how tunable is this technology. So of course we can choose the type of material which we sequence. So one layer of this, 2 layers of this, 1 layer of another, 3 layers of that. But then we can also control even the rotation between them. So you just put 2 layers together, and then if you start to rotate, you form this so-called Moira pattern, and that by itself changes the properties of the resulting structures dramatically. For example, this way people manage to get the results from Pablo from MIT. People managed to get superconductivity in carbon materials, or insulating insulators, mod insulators in semiconductors. So it's really there is fantastic versatility and tunability of this technology. So I don't want to go into details on this, but we can make it ferromagnetic just by rotation, for example. So really very just quite a few knobs that we have. So this is basically the current status of material science, that we start to move from the existing materials, from relying on the existing materials only, to tailored materials, to custom materials, so we can control their properties, we can design those materials on the atomic scale, and we can tune their properties for specific applications. But let me now try to look a little bit into the future and ask ourselves, if we are allowed to dream about any materials we want, what kind of materials we actually want. So I know what we can create, but what do we actually want? And so let me share with you not my dreams, but the dreams of the directors of this movie. So I'm sure that many of you recognize it's Terminator 2, right? So the plot, so the movie was shot in '91, and the plot is that the robot, I guess not many people actually seen the movie, so the robot from the future, and the future was set in 2029 for them, was sent back to '91 to kill Sarah Connor and her son, right? And I'm only showing it to you because I want you to see how people in '91 dreamt about future material. So it needs to be flexible, adjustable, I don't know, liquid metal, so be self-repair, so changing color, changing shape. So now we are, so I should apologize so we are in 2023, and I guess you would agree that unfortunately we are a bit far away from that dream. And frankly, the worst part is that if we continue on the same path, we will never come in 2029. We will never come to those robots ever. And the reason is not just that it's the problem with the robotics. It's generally our technology is very much top down. So it means that individual components in our technologies, they are not functional. So the functionality only comes when you assemble them into a system. So you basically focus all the functionality only on the system level. And that's the reason why our silicon technology is so complex. So you basically just put everything, you put all the functionality on one level. Biologic, and it's true not only about clockworking or robotics, or all our systems are the same. Now, biological systems actually operate on a completely different principle. There, the functionality is spread across different levels, right? So individual proteins, they're functional. They're so the individual membranes in the cells, organs, and so on. We don't think. So we don't control, okay, we need this protein to unfold, just catalyze something, then fold back, and so on. It is done somehow by itself, so it is the internal properties of those structures. And that's actually what we would really like to see. We would like to move some of the functionality from the system level to the material level. Let's make our materials to functional and intelligent by themselves. And now, for some reason, I have a bit of a problem with my computer, which I really don't understand why. Sorry, guys. I might have to actually close it and start again. So, So how do we do it? How can we create materials which are functional in their own rights, and so they can perform certain functions without being controlled from outside world. So just let me try to connect again. Can you see it? Right. Okay. So we try to invent those functional intelligent material. Functional means that they can be programmed to do to do certain work depending on the particular conditions and intelligence. Well, there are many definitions of intelligence, but let's say the simplest one, that they have memory, so they can learn something. So just one example. For some time, so people have been playing with graphene membranes, for example, for water desalination, for gas exploration, and so on. In Singapore, 100% of water comes from desalination through those membranes, not graphene, but some membranes. But okay, imagine even if you have the best membrane ever, you still need to control its quality. You still need to put some sensor into the stream, and then you would this sensor sends a signal to the computer. Computer analyzes it, sends a signal to the actuator, which closes or opens the valve. But imagine that you can drop all those functions into the material itself, into the membrane itself. If you make it functional, it can change its properties depending on the particular species it sees, and then just open or close depending on the conditions. So you basically put the sensor, the actuator, and the analyzer functions into the material. Then there are a few other examples as well. I won't go into those now. So the idea is great. The problem is that if you try to make materials with memory and functional, it means that they would necessarily be out of equilibrium, and that's what physics doesn't really know how to do. So we're really bad with the out of equilibrium system. So all our experience is only with the in equilibrium materials, in equilibrium systems, and then if you want to do something out of equilibrium, you can a little bit add some perturbation theory, and then try to study those properties. So we're really bad at predicting those dynamic properties. So what do? The only we can actually guess how those materials should look like. Well, we know that they need to be probably composite and with the strong interaction between the components, but also that there should be some multiple interaction between those components. And then if you do this, you create so-called degenerate energy landscape. So there are many energy levels which are close to each other, and then you can navigate a pathway which is almost adiabatic, and then you can create some useful function and return to the original state. So it's not a new idea. That's exactly how proteins in our body work. So they have many possible folding stages and states, and those states, they correspond to different functionalities, but then there are pathways how to fold and then return back so to unfold, and how to return back into the folded state. So that's exactly what we do. We try to use it on the material level. So we utilize different components of different load dimensionality. We try not to work with the three-dimensional materials because it's very difficult to change the bulk, and we really need to be able to change the internal properties of the material. So we need to make this material, this composite material, to be responsive for a particular stimuli with a certain response, but also change its internal structures, have a phase transition inside. So we basically, what we do, we engineer multiple numbers of the phase transitions, and then you can make it functional, programmable, but also you can program memory function inside of those materials as well. So, as I said, it's actually very difficult to do it with the traditional physical formalism. So we increasingly use machine learning, and in particular dynamic machine learning here. And of course, you have to use to create big data through the robotic labs. So this is just, so here is an example of a student robotic lab. So we just a very basic approach. You take a video how your student work and then create a lab which mimics the behavior of the students. It works, but in reality, the real robotics labs they're much less versatile. So the real labs, so they're not of course they don't look like this. You actually have to you actually have to properly design a robot for a particular function. So we have robots to measure membranes. We have robots to measure drug delivery systems. So they synthesize, they measure them in the same setup. So we don't need actually robots which move around and use their arms and try to open the bottles. So, but here is an example of such a dynamic machine learning. So we create machine learning to learn the behavior of the folded and unfolded polymer chains. It's not exactly proteins yet, so there is no charge here, but it's a basic polymer. But basically through observing the behavior of those proteins, so of those polymers, the neural network, if you give it a little bit of the knowledge about physics, so here we just gave it only the Onsager relation, then it can predict the folding and unfolding trajectories, how many knots or just how many folds would you get if you apply certain force to it. So it can predict it very well. So those protein folding is not the only dynamic problem which we would like to solve. So here is another example of a dynamic material. So this is now the high entropy alloy which was programmed to have the self-healing property, for example. So you basically drill a hole in it and then give it a little bit of energy, and then you can program to self-heal and close this hole entirely. So it's clearly very out of equilibrium material, but it can be programmed to perform certain function. So here is another example of the out of equilibrium. I'm not sure if you can call it material, but definitely composite. So you can think about it as a biological fuel cell. You basically combine bacteria with metal form. So in this case, it was we either use graphene form, or it's even better if you use metal polymer, and you can you choose those bacteria which can emit electron during their life cycle. Then you can collect this electron and use it in the external circuit. You basically start with one bacteria, some monomers, you add some sugar or lactose. Those electrons help to polymerize your conductive network, and then at the end you get a battery which you only need to feed sugar, and then you get electrons into your external circuit. So that's the way how those bacteria look on the graphene network. And I should say there are many other examples of this. So we're trying to create smart drug delivery, which can be programmed to open a capsule, which can be open and closed under certain conditions. So the reason why we cannot take just a pill with the COVID vaccine is because those vesicles, they're not stable under low under low pH, if you can close it in low pH of your stomach and then program it to open in your bloodstream, you would solve this sort of problem. Or those functional materials can be used on much larger scale as well. So actuators which can be programmed to respond to different humidity, light of different color or different temperature, and so on. So I think I will probably stop here just to say that. So I showed you two stages in material science. So currently, we start to work on the custom tailored materials which we can design for specific properties. But really, we don't want properties, we want functionalities, we want dynamic materials which can think on their own and which can change their properties depending on the external conditions and maybe even learn from those and make decision on their own. Thanks a lot. Sorry for the problems with the computer. It's really a pleasure to present to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Konstantin. We invite Dr. Yang to moderate the Q&A.
Thank you, Konstantin, for a very insightful, interesting conversation lecture that we've just heard. So I'm Le from IMRI, the Institute of Materials Research and Engineering of A*STAR. So I'll try to aid this discussion along. So we have many physical audience here. So I've already seen there are people lining up for questions. You can introduce yourself and then followed by the question. And for our online audiences who are tuning in, please feel free to type in your questions on the online platform, and we will, if the time permits, we will get through those as well. Yes, please. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful talk. I'm Noemi from University of Cambridge in the UK. I just wanted to know, so humans and living beings are the produce of virtually millions of years of evolution. And so I just wanted to know if you had like a wild guess into, how long will it take to get the next Terminator, like in real life?
I guess no one really needs a Terminator, otherwise it will have been created already. Maybe people are scared of those. But I think the dynamic problems and those devices which can live their own life and change their behavior depending on particular parameters, I think it's actually quite close. It's definitely so we definitely understand quite a lot about, well, much more about intelligence, though definitely not everything. So we definitely learned about it quite a lot with the use of AI. I mean, I'm outside of this area, but I'm becoming a great user and maybe even believer into this system, into this technology. So I think we will see those functional materials getting into our life more and more. Of course, we don't really understand how life works, and why and what really the evolutionary pressure. We tell those stories and we think we understand, but I'm afraid the situation is much more complex than that. When we design those materials, we probably don't need to learn entirely from biology. So we don't need to utilize the same evolutionary pressure on our materials. So we can make it playing by our own rules, by way simpler rules. So if they're simpler, you can probably it will be easier to control.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks as well. So the gentleman here, please.
This is Philip Kloser from the University of Cambridge. Before graphene, there were carbon nanotubes. I myself work on carbon nanotubes. Can you maybe comment on the role of one-dimensional materials versus two-dimensional materials in the future?
Sorry, again, the question is whether there is any future for one-dimensional materials.
Yes, because the hype has died down and has been mostly replaced by two-dimensional materials.
I mean, I don't really. I mean, I'm a physicist, so I naturally prefer two dimensions because it just gives you a little bit of more room to play, but less than in three, so you get some interesting topological properties. But in terms of, I don't think you can choose materials simply by the dimensionality. So there is so much interest in physics in carbon nanotubes. I don't think one-dimensional materials are better or worse. Even coming to applications. So these days, both graphene and carbon nanotubes, they use in thousands of tons in a variety of different applications. So personally, I think the two dimensions is a little bit just because of mathematics. It just sits on this border case, and the phase transitions look different, and so it is the property of the Coulomb law in two dimensions. But in terms of materials, I think all of them are going to be used and are being used already.
All right, thank you. Yes, please, the gentleman.
Hello, Professor. So I'm Shapnadi from India, and my question is regarding another class of materials which has also come to the fore recently for its application in optoelectronic devices mainly, that is metal halide perovskites. So, and also they are recently also being used in different kinds of other electronic devices as well. So how do you see this perovskite competing with these 2D materials, and if someday they can come to that level of maturity? So what's your comment on them?
Well, if only, I don't think you're asking the right person. So when I mean, I really follow this hype cycle with graphene, same with perovskite and metal halide perovskites as well. I think the science there is quite exciting. What we see in metal halide perovskites, how much chances will it get in applications? It's very difficult to predict because it's not only it doesn't only matter how good is your technology, so it also matters how good is the technology you're competing with. So we invested so much money into silicon that it's going to be very difficult to displace it. Silicon photovoltaics, it's been developing for 40 years at least, and I think it will be very difficult to compete with this technology. But I mean, we are scientists, right? So our job is to produce new knowledge and enjoy it. So and in that sense, I think perovskites are quite interesting materials.
Yeah, fully agree with that. Thank you. Well, we are having a few online questions, so maybe I'll address one of them first. I'll pop it on the screen. Do you see manufacturing of these materials, 2D graphene, to be more energy and cost intensive than conventional systems?
What are conventional systems? So the answer is I don't know. But for example, we burn a lot of hydrocarbons, and and some of them we just burn because we don't know what to do with it, right? So if you mine oil, or if you pump oil, you basically burn the supporting gas. So which and you pay carbon credits for it. Instead, it's so easy to make, say, carbon nanotubes or graphene. So it would actually come at negative cost rather than it's very difficult to say how much does it cost, because it
depends on what we compare it with, I guess. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Another popular question online seems to be asking, how do you feel getting the Nobel Prize at such an early age of, in your 30s? This could be a question that you receive quite regularly.
It's, I mean, I'm trying not to talk about this, and I really try to avoid even pronouncing the word at all. So, I mean,
that's fine then.
Difficult to again. So what I try to say to myself that so the Nobel Prize was for the initial observation of graphene and for our first experiments on it. So I said that I would never show any of those data ever again. I will only show the data for which I and the results which we get after the prize. So it's I'm not even sure what to say.
It's fine. All right, we will move on to the next question then. I forgot who came first. Maybe the lady. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, this is Catherine from the University of California, Berkeley. And as a computer scientist, my question for you was, I know you mentioned using machine learning in your work, and I guess I was kind of wondering what your thoughts on the future of these developing technologies, and in the future if it would ultimately have the possibility of replacing to some degree lab work, and what that would look like.
There is a big question about those foundational models and how much trust do you put into the AI for hypothesis creation and verification. Currently, I think it's a fantastic tool to support our work, and though the creative work comes from the scientist. Will it ever replace the scientist entirely? I mean, it can replace the lab, so that's a possibility, and I'm sure it will have its say in the design of those facilities and in the design of the scientific instruments. But how much would it have in replacing the scientist with the creative work? I don't know. I don't know what is the nature of creativity, where all the ideas are coming from. Have no idea. I mean, I usually enjoy when they come in my dreams. Can AI dream? Don't know, but I think it's a legitimate way of getting new results. So I think it's going to be used a lot. Replacing scientists, probably not.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's wonderful answers. Actually, we are running out of time. The timer has just gone off. I do have a quick question. Is that a quick one that we can entertain, perhaps?
I presume so. Thank you very much for your talk. You showed a structure that was self-folding. I thought, could you envision a structure that is even lower dimensional, where you have just the molecules and it is self-assembling and self-folding?
Right. So there were some cartoons and those unfolding which of the two-dimensional structures. We can control it, and there are ways how to do it. It's basically all about charging and controlling the interaction between charges between the Coulomb and controlling the direction between Coulomb and van der Waals. But so that's in theory. In practice, I showed some of the bulk structures. So they work on similar manner, but there are a few other. There are capillary forces are involved as well. So it's the charging van der Waals and capillary.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, everyone who still have questions, maybe over tea break or something outside, we could catch Konstantin for a quick chat. Thank you, everyone, for your great attention, and thank you for giving such a wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Konstantin and Dr. Yang, there's no tea break, so please remain. Our next speaker is Prof Stefan Hell. He'll be joining us virtually for his talk entitled Molecule Scale Resolution in Fluorescence Microscopy. The Q&A session will be moderated by Prof Liu Xiaogang. Prof Hell, please.
Hello, can you hear me well? I'm going to speak about fluorescence microscopy, the molecule scale resolution. So throughout the 20th century, the resolution of any light microscope and also fluorescent light microscope was fundamentally limited by diffraction to about 200 nanometers. And the best resolving microscope at that time was the confocal microscope, which could provide some higher, say, contrast, but not a better resolution. Now, the turn of the 20th century witnessed the development of a new type of microscopy, namely that of stat microscopy, which showed that it's possible to overcome the diffraction barrier and as a result, get a spatial resolution that is substantially better, up to a factor of 10. So stat microscopy showed that there is viable physics, so to speak, in this world that allows you to get beyond the diffraction barrier, which people believe that it wouldn't be possible for fundamental reasons. Now, this factor of 10, of course, made a substantial difference, as you can see here, because you can see details in a cell, for example, that you couldn't see before. And this has led to a share of the 2014 Chemistry Nobel Prize, and this is the official poster of the Nobel Foundation showing the development of stat microscopy, or the working principles of stat microscopy, and the working principles of palm storm microscopy, which was a method that was developed about 6 years later, but has a number of, say, specific traits that made it very valuable. It also provided a spatial resolution increase roughly by a factor of 10. And it also operated on the same, say, physical principle, which I will speak about in a few minutes, namely to separate molecules, fluorescence molecules, by turning them on and off. But the difference here in palm storm was that the molecules were turned on and off individually, stochastically in space, whereas in stat microscopy, the molecules were turned on and off using a, say, structured pattern of light, a beam of light that had a clear shape in space. Now, each of the methods has advantages and disadvantages, of course, but one thing that they have in common is the fact that they can, in principle, attain a spatial resolution that goes down to the size of a molecule, so to about 1 nanometer or so. But in reality, at the time the Nobel Prize was given, the resolution was not better than 20 nanometers or so. So it provided, both methods provided increase by a factor of 10, which of course was substantial. Nonetheless, they did not attain the ultimate limit, which was the resolution at the size of the molecule itself. What does that mean? It means that if you have molecules that are just 3, 4, 5 nanometers apart, you couldn't tell them apart at the time the Nobel Prize was given, because that was still too close, you know? And the size of a molecule is about 1 to 2 nanometers, so you couldn't distinguish them. Therefore, I'd say that while the microscopes crossed the threshold, as it was put here on the poster, I'd say that they did not attain the ultimate limit. And this is the reason why in my lab, after 2014, we put a lot of emphasis to get down to the ultimate limit, to get a spatial resolution that reaches, say, the 1, 2, 3 nanometer scale, so the size of the molecule itself. Now, in order to get there, of course, you have to understand what makes, say, nanoscopy, fluorescence nanoscopy, or super resolution fluorescence microscopy, some people call it, what makes it tick. And in order to explain this to you, I'm preparing just a few slides. So don't worry if you didn't understand how the principles of these methods come about. I'm going to explain it now, and don't worry about it. It'll be very simple. Now, the problem or the reason why people said that it's not possible to get a spatial resolution that is below 200 nanometers was the fact that you cannot focus the light more sharply than down to about 200 nanometers. So if this is the spot size of light, the smallest that you can create, this greenish circle, then molecules that are just, say, 11 nanometers apart, like those that are arranged here on this pattern, cannot be discerned. Why? Because that big blob of light would make all of them shine at the same time. So basically, they were illuminated with light, and then they would say scatter light back or fluoresce light back, and then since they would do it at the same time, because they illuminated at the same time, it wouldn't be possible to distinguish them. So the key solution to the problem, and this applies to any of these methods, STAT, Palm Storm, and there are many acronyms by now, PAINT, whatever, or some people call it single molecule localization. The essence, really the real essence of it, is the fact that you make sure that despite the fact that all of the molecules are illuminated at the same time, not all of them are capable of emitting light back, so scattering light back, fluorescing light back. So even though there is this green beam of light, what was the key element here is that there is a mechanism, one sort of mechanism here, in one of these molecules, or in these molecules, that make sure that they do not emit. Only this one is emitting. And because this one is emitting, you can discern it from the rest. You may not know which one it is, yeah, but you know it's only one, and this one is distinguishable from the rest. And then how do you get the other ones? Well, you have to turn this one off, and then you get the next one, and the next one emitting, and then that one off, then you get the other one emitting, but the other ones here, the black ones, have to be off. And this on-off principle allows one to distinguish the molecules, so to notice that these are different molecules. It's not just one molecule. And this is actually, this single molecule on and off switching is a hallmark of the Palm Storm principle. But if you turn molecules individually on and off, of course, you have the problem that you don't know which one it is. I mean, it could have been also this one, that one, that one. So how do you know it's this one? Well, the way you find out which one it is that you find out where the molecule is actually sitting, where it's actually placed, where it's actually located. And this is done by calculating actually, or finding out the position where it has been emitted. So the next step is not only to discern them, say by turning them on and off, but also to find out where they are with the highest possible precision. Okay, and so if we find out, where the molecule is, then we know it must be this one, because this is the position from where it's emitting. And this is done in Palm Storm by a process which is called localization. I will talk about that in a minute. And then, of course, everything depends on how well you can localize individual molecules. Now, the problem with the way they were localized in this Palm Storm method was the precision was not good enough, as I'm indicating here, because if the precision is so bad, as you can see here in the circle, that it's actually larger than the distance between the molecules, then you cannot tell them apart. You know, it doesn't work. If the precision is so bad, who knows that it's this molecule? Could have also have been that molecule or that molecule or that molecule, for that matter. So in Palm Storm, while molecules were discerned individually, which is very, very good, of course, the precision was insufficient to find out exactly which molecule it was, simply because the precision of localization was not good enough. And this is why I looked into this problem again to find out if there's a better way of localizing molecules. Now, before explaining to you why there is a better way and how it works, I'm just showing you now why the standard method doesn't work well. So in a typical, say, Palm Storm experiment, single molecule localization experiment, we find the following setting. We have a microscopy arrangement where we have an objective lens, of course, and there is a light source, a laser, for example, and then there is a molecule here in the sample region. And usually the molecules are illuminated, or the whole field of view is illuminated uniformly. And then there is a molecule here, and now we need to find out where it is. So what it's done, usually the fluorescence is collected, the fluorescence emitted by the molecule. It is focused onto a camera, the one that you see here, many pixels. And then what will be produced on the camera? A blob of light. The blob of light will be nothing but the fluorescence diffraction pattern produced by a single molecule. So because fluorescent light is diffracted as well, we get here a blob of light here that is white, that is relatively white. Okay, and then the position is found out just by saying, and this is to some extent justified, that the maximum of this pattern must coincide in space by simple geometric optics with the position of the molecule. So you can say that if the molecule is here, then the pattern must be here, and if the molecule shifts a bit to the side, the pattern must also be shifted to the side. So, but the maximum must always coincide by geometric optics with the position of the molecule. And then everything boils down to calculating the maximum of emission here on the diffraction pattern. And that precision here, with which you can calculate that, scales inversely with the square root of the number of detected photons on the camera. So the more photons you detect, so the brighter the pattern is, of course, the better you find out its maximum. This is not surprising, because if you have just a few photons, then the pattern here will be noisy, then it's very difficult to find out its maximum. However, if there is many photons making up that pattern, then of course the pattern will be very well defined. So this is why the precision scales with the number of detected photons on the camera. So bright molecules, of course, give very high precision. Now, this principle of maximizing the number of fluorescence detection comes with problems. Why? In reality, if you work with fluorescent molecules, and that's what's done in fluorescence microscopy, of course, the number of emitted photons is limited by bleaching, because the molecules, like the fluorophore, they tend to fade out, like colors in your genes or whatever, they bleach. Of course, this is also the case for fluorescent molecules. There's another problem. If you need many detected photons, the method is slow because you need to wait. And then there is another problem, which is even more serious. Of course, fluorophores and molecules in general and also atoms are dipole emitters. So meaning that they do not emit uniformly, they emit in certain directions. And therefore, if they turn their position in space, the pattern will be shifted as well. So it's not true that the maximum of emission just always coincides with the position of the molecule. And this can be off by a serious amount, 10 nanometers, 20 nanometers. And this also contributes to the fact that this method is limited in the actual precision that you get. Okay, now, what is the solution to the problem? And the solution to the problem is, in retrospect, of course, very simple. And the reason why I got this idea was that I worked on STED microscopy, and STED uses donut-shaped beams. And what I realized is that the hallmark of a method like STED is that you inject the coordinate in space with a beam of light. And this is actually what we're going to do now in order to find out the position of the molecule. So rather than using an uniform illumination of light, so in this new method, which I'm calling min-flux, we use a pattern of light that is shaped like a donut. And of course, this pattern of light perfectly defines a coordinate in space, which is the zero of that intensity, zero intensity value of the donut here in the center. And then, of course, this is perfectly determined by the incoming beam, because the laser has many photons, and you're not limited number of photons that would determine, of course, the position of the molecule. And then it's very easy. Everything boils down to finding out the position of the molecule, the unknown position of the molecule, with respect to the position of that donut-shaped beam, or to be precise, with respect to the zero of the donut-shaped beam. Now, if they are quite far apart like this, and here, this is light, of course, for exciting the molecules, then you can imagine the molecule emits very brightly, because there's a lot of green light that would excite it, and that fluorescence would be measured here by the detector. Okay, but if the two coincide in space, then the zero of the donut coincides with the molecule, of course, and then there is no excitation, because here the intensity of the donut is zero, and there will be no detected light here, because the molecule will not emit. So, in other words, the brightness will indicate how far the molecule is away from the zero. If it's slightly away, there will be some emission. If it's far away, like here, there will be strong emission. Just notice that there is no camera. So here we have a normal detector that just counts the number of emissions. So we don't need a pattern of light or something that we measure, just plain photons, brightness of the molecule. And I'm telling you now why this concept actually saves a number of detected photons, why this concept is so powerful. So in order to explain this to you, I decided to introduce a demon. It's kind of like Maxwell's demon. And like all demons, the demon knows something that we humans wouldn't know. And I'm explaining to you the power of this conceptual, of this concept of introducing a demon. Now let's imagine for the moment we need to find out the position of the molecule, or the demon needs to find it out, but the demon knows where it is. So what does the demon do? The demon acts on the beam to shift it around, and always shifts the beam, the excitation beam, such that the zero coincides in space with the position of the molecule. Always coincide in space. Now, if that is the case, of course, there will be no emission here. There was no fluorescence emission at all. Yet, the demon could, of course, perfectly tell where the molecule is. Okay? The demon could perfectly localize the molecule in space, although the molecule is moving, would always know where it is. Why? Because the demon knows that it must coincide in space with the position, the molecule must coincide in space with the position of the donut. And so the power of this thought experiment is that it shows that you can come up with a concept for localizing the position of the molecule where there is no fluorescence emission. There's no detection. We do not require the molecule to emit. Now remember, in the previous case, in the Palm Storm case, you require to maximize the number of detected photons. Here, what you do conceptually, at least, you minimize them. You put them down to zero. And this is, of course, very advantageous. Why? Because it makes the method fast. If you don't need to wait to get many photons, it's fast. It's more precise because the photons are very informative, of course. And of course, it's therefore much more powerful than previously. So what we do is we actually try to avoid fluorescence emission rather than to maximize it. And then there is another point. There is no wavelength dependence anymore in this scheme, which is striking if you're a physicist and say, oh, come on, this is all diffracted beams of light. Why should there be no wavelength dependence? It's in retrospect not surprising. Why? Because what we do in this concept is we match 2 points. The molecule is a point, sort of, and the zero of the donut is a point. If you match 2 points, the wavelengths here or the size of the donut doesn't really matter. It could be larger, could be smaller. So this is why the diffraction doesn't play any role. And this leads to a concept in microscopy that works entirely with focused light, yet there is no wavelength dependence, which is really striking. Okay, now in reality, there's no such thing as a demon, but in reality, you can come up with something that comes close to it. And that is the following. Rather than having a demon here, we have a controller that measures the number of detections. Of course, there will be some cases where the zero does not coincide with the molecule. There will be some fluorescence emission and detections. And then the controller acts on the beam deflector. And what the controller does, the software does, it tries to minimize the distance actually between the molecule and the donut zero. And the better that match is, the fewer photons you need, and the better the precision will be. And then, of course, you can trace the position of the molecule with very high precision, yet you need much, much, much fewer photons than you would need, say, in a normal localization modality. Now, in reality, of course, it is done in the following way. If the molecule is supposed to be somewhere in between the 2 dots, the purple dot and the orange dot, how do we know now where it is? It's very simple. We scan this donut across the molecule, and once a zero coincides in space with the molecule, the fluorescence here is 0, and this is where the position of the molecule must be located, where the 2 coincide in space. So scanning it The donut over the molecule just tells us what the molecule is. It's very simple. Now, in reality, you don't even need to do that, because it's perfectly sufficient to measure the fluorescence that is found when the donut is at the endpoints here and here. Why? Because this curve here is very well known. This is a parabola. So the 0 is the first approximation of parabola. And if you have the measured points here and 0 and 1, you can easily calculate where xm is. So you can instantly jump from here to here and find out the position of the molecule. So within this quadratic approximation, it's sufficient to jump from one place to the other. Then you can easily calculate where xm is. So this is a simple equation, and then you have the position. And this equation is very, very, very useful, because it tells you instantly there's no dependence on the wavelengths, and there's no dependence on the molecular orientation. And the reason is we put actually the burden of requiring many photons to localize the molecule on the excitation beam. In the past, it was on the emission beam. Here it is now on the excitation beam. And the excitation beam is perfectly controlled in space, because that's done by the beam deflector and the laser. And so that's the deep physics behind it. So you always need many photons to localize something or to get a coordinate. But now the emphasis is put on the pattern of light with which you illuminate rather than which you detect. Now, if you calculate the precision with which the molecule can be localized, you will find, and that's not surprising, that it scales inversely with the square root of the total number of detected photons. So the more photons you detect, the more precise you will get, but it scales only with the square root, as we've seen before. But now the new thing is, it also scales with the average distance between the molecule and the position where the donut is actually placed. And this is only a linear relationship, and this is good, because it means that once we have roughly estimated where it is, we can bring the 0 closer and closer and closer, and the precision will go linearly up with this distance L. And so we have a handle on getting the precision up just by bringing the 0 closer, as it is done in this thought experiment that I've shown you with the demon. Okay, so this is really important, because as a matter of fact, if we do it iteratively, the precision scales exponentially. So we can crank up the precision exponentially with the average distance, whereas here, of course, in the normal localization, scales with the square root, which is, of course, very bad. So bringing the 0 closer to the molecule really gets up the position. Of course, in 2 dimensions, you would not have 2 points, you would have 3 points, or 4 for that matter. It's even better. Without boring you with the details, of course, the precision still scales with L, and this is shown in here. So once you know roughly where it is, you bring the 0 on average closer to the molecule, and the precision goes up. As a rule of thumb, this method of localizing molecules needs 100 times fewer photons in practice as compared to a standard localization modality, which is used throughout the world in thousands of labs. So I'm arguing they do it the wrong way when it comes to finding out the position of the molecule. Okay, so how does it translate in high resolution? It's very simple. Now, remember that these molecules that are arranged like this in a normal palm storm, which was given a share of the Nobel Prize, say 8 years back, couldn't discern the molecules. But now this method, MinFlux, because of its higher localization precision, because fewer photons are enough to get the high precision, you can separate them very, very clearly, as you've seen in the measurement. 6 nanometers apart can be clearly solved, not in Palm Storm, but in MinFlux. So in other words, although we use just focus visible light regular lenses, provided that we separate by on-off, of course, that's clear, we can reach the maximum optical resolution of fluorophores. And as I indicated already, without wavelength dependence. The only wavelength dependence comes from the fact that, okay, we need to excite a certain molecule, and a certain molecule needs a certain excitation wavelength. Say some molecules in green light, some in yellow light, but the actual wavelengths really doesn't really matter, because that's overcome. Now, can you take large fields of views? Of course, because the one I've shown you were just molecules at small distances. Yes, you just scan, for example, this donut over a field of view, and then you get pictures with a high spatial resolution and of course with a high localization precision. So here it's below 1 nanometer. As you see, median is 0.9. And if you look at it, so these are so-called nuclear pore complexes, similar to the structure I've shown on the you've seen on the Nobel poster. And here the resolution is much better. It's better by a factor of 10. And these little patches can be associated actually with individual molecules. Now, if we compare it with STEP microscopy, which was developed, say, a decade back or more than a decade back, it's still worse by a factor of 10, and the standard resolution is worse by a factor of 100. So you have a factor of 10 here, another factor of 10 here. So now the resolution is better by a factor of 100 rather than just by a factor of 10. And the molecule scale has been reached. Now, not only can this method be used for imaging, it can also be used for tracking molecules, as I indicated already. And in order to demonstrate this, I have decided that we work on the tracking of a certain protein that is well studied, and one of them is kinesin. But before showing you this kinesin, I'm just indicating to you how this tracking works. So again, if a molecule moves like that on trajectory, we just quickly measure the positions around it and find out where the molecule is. And in this way, you can quickly track the position of molecule, and you can do that 50 to 100 times faster than before, than with a camera. Why? Because you need 50 to 100 times fewer photons, and then you don't have to wait for so long. And now I'm showing you this kinesin movement. Now, some of you may know that kinesin is a motor protein that walks on microtubules, and it carries cargo with it and neurotransmitters and so on. And when it walks, it makes steps of 8 nanometers. It makes a hand-over-hand procession on microtubules. As a matter of fact, our precision is so good, yeah, that not only we could measure these steps, so this is just a measurement of the position here of this fluorescent molecule on the stalk of this kinesin, but we could also measure substeps, because we have a precision of below 1 nanometer attained within 5 milliseconds. In the past, because they required 100 times more photons, they needed 300 milliseconds to get the same precision. So we are faster. Then we can measure substeps, yeah, and the mechanistic details. And without boring you with the details of kinesin, I'm just indicating that we can measure much smaller steps because we can look with a higher temporal resolution into the details of the movement. And not only that, we can also use it to find out how this say heads, that's what they call, of kinesin just move. And this can be done, for example, by labeling the head here at the end. Then you watch how this fluorophore changes its position in space, yeah, and then you label it here and watch again how this fluorophore changes its position in space. These are the data. And so if we do that and measure the tracks, you find out mechanistic details that couldn't be seen before. And we could see that the steps have bias to the right and so on, and we find out about the details. I'm not going to speak about that. It's published, actually will come out very visibly soon. I would like to come back to STAT microscopy, which kind of opened the field. Now, in STAT microscopy, what you have is an excitation beam. You have a beam which is donut shaped, which now turns molecules off. And then here, this is the remaining region in which the molecules are still allowed to emit. Now, this method is now being used in many labs throughout the world. It's very convenient, produces pictures, but as I said, only pictures that have a spatial resolution between 20 and 40 nanometers. So it's roughly a factor of 10 beyond the diffraction barrier. But of course, we have the ambition of getting better and better. And one way of doing it is to turn molecules on individually, as we've seen before, but now use this, say, coordinate targeted of STAT in order to get a higher, say, precision information. And this can be done by making this donut, so to speak, circle around the molecule such that the zero coincides with the molecule in space. And then again, you have this phenomenon of injecting a coordinate and localizing it with a donut, making it very precise. And again, without going into the details too much, we have managed to locate molecules down with sub-nanometer precision, so 0.5 nanometers, 5 angstrom, and with 10,000 photons we get down to 2 angstrom. So this is 10 times below the actual size of the fluorophore. Yeah, so it's really crazy at room temperature. Yeah, some people did that before with low temperature, which has a lot of problems and vibrations, and not practical, really, especially not for biology, to see real movements, of course, because everything is frozen. We can see that at room temperature. And so molecules that are just 5 nanometer apart with this method can easily be discerned, as you can see here. So again, keep in mind, this is 150 times below the wavelength that is used. And if you put the size of the fluorophores in relation, like 4 nanometers the size, 2 nanometers the diameter of the fluorophore, they're just 4 nanometers apart, yet they can be discerned. So it really shows that we're really down with the resolution at the molecular scale. And these are so-called Minstead pictures, again, of the nuclear pores. They all look different. If you average, say, 81 of them, say, in space, then you get a sort of average image of something, and this nicely fits actually with what you get from cryo-EM. But cryo-EM, by definition, gives only averaged pictures because it's taken out of many electron density scattering pictures. Here, of course, you still get the individual, say, situation of individual fluorophores. So to sum up, since my time is up, the physics part of fluorescence microscopy resolution is solved, in my view. So the essence is, and that you separate them by preparing them in 2 different states for the measurement, for the time point of measurement, time point of detection. That has been the missing piece that kept fluorescence microscopy diffraction limited throughout the century. But this essence of discerning it by playing on and off with them, that actually broke the diffraction barrier. And then the maximum resolution has also been solved by doing it in such a way that the position of the molecule is found out not by looking at a pattern of light that is produced by the molecule and the fluorescence of the molecule, but by using a pattern of light that is again produced by the laser, as it is done in STED microscopy, and matching that pattern with the position of the molecule. So this is arguably, in my view, the best way of doing it. And these 2 principles will be very difficult to overcome because they are really powerful and fundamental. And not surprisingly, they were the first actually to lead to a spatial resolution that is at the end of the day, as I'm showing here in this red sentence, no longer dependent on the wavelengths. And this is mind-boggling. I'm saying that. You have now in fluorescence microscopy, far field, focused light fluorescence microscopy, a resolution that doesn't depend on the wavelengths anymore. The limits that are set by the chemistry of labeling, fluorophore size, and this type of thing, and biologists now have to worry about this, and chemists have to worry about this, but the physics is sorted out. Applications are many: molecular maps, protein dynamics, drug discovery, you name it. And with that, I'm coming to my acknowledgement slide, showing the people who have really done the say practical work and experimental work in the lab. And we have a lot of fun developing this. And with that, I'm thanking you for listening so patiently. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof Hell. We now invite Prof Liu to moderate the Q&A.
Good morning, Professor Stefan Hell, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So next time when you walk into a laboratory, right, you can ask a good question, right? Are you using a microscope or are you using a nanoscope? Because now with Professor Stefan Hell's work, right, the resolution of the so-called microscope goes from 1 micrometer to almost 1 nanometer. That's a remarkable work and a wonderful talk. So now is the Q&A session. So the first question is Lily, please. Yeah.
Hello, thank you, Professor Stefan. I'm Isha from Cambridge doing computational biology. I used some deep learning methods to do like confocal imaging analysis. So I'm curious, like, could you please give us some comments on using machine learning methods on your molecular fluorescent like imaging analysis, like 2D or 3D segmentation, cell tracking, or cell-to-cell false inference?
Yes, it's a very good point that you're raising. It's very clear that the methods that I've developed here and discussed here are purely physics-based, if you will, and of course there's a huge potential in taking advantage of the methods that were developed in data sciences, including say artificial intelligence and on all these interesting say approaches that are coming up right now. Of course, there's a lot of potential in interpreting the data, segmenting data, as you mentioned, in a much more clever way as it is done, as it has been done so far. And the combination of applying, say, new computational algorithms, whatever that is, artificial intelligence, and so on, both for evaluating the actual measurements, so evaluating the photon traces and evaluating the biological outcome, will be definitely a very, very interesting topic for the coming years. And these methods now that are being applied to structure biology and any other fields, of course, will be applied also to fluorescence microscopy to great effect, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Okay, we also, okay, this gentleman, please.
Thank you, Professor, for this wonderful talk. So my name is Neelkant. I am from India working in Hong Kong. So as you showed that the precision of this microscopy is scales as 1 by square root n. So however, like by using quantum effects, like quantum imaging, the scaling can be 1 by n. So I wanted to know what is the current experimental progress in quantum imaging for microscopy and what are the main challenges to be overcome in this field?
Yeah, so to be very clear, so in the past, yeah, the scaling was 1 over square root of n. Here, the methods I've shown, it's not 1 over square root of n. Yeah, it is only if you stay with it. Actually, it's exponential. So the thing is that if you bring the zero closer to the molecule, then it goes exponentially with the number of photons. And this is why this is, as I said, very hard to beat. If you take advantage of quantum, say non-classical light and all this type of stuff, you may get 1 over n, but it will never be the exponential. This is why I personally believe that the methods that I've shown here, because it has this exponential increase of the precision, yeah, with the number of photons, it's still superior to any of these so arguably fashionable quantum imaging modalities.
Thank you.
Okay, Professor Stefan Hell, we also have many online participants and they raise many interesting questions. So let me just flash one question to you. What do you think the next step is? Will it be possible for someday achieve a laser or light focus of 1 nanometer or even smaller than that?
Yeah, well, that'll be hard to do, of course, for obvious reasons. I mean, it's Heisenberg's uncertainty principle that has to be applied to photons. So I discovered that this of course is the wrong way of thinking about the resolution. To try to focus the light down to 1 nanometer. That's why I gave it up. I said that there's no point. Of course, people have tried that. Actually, they tried to squeeze the light down to tiny holes, so-called near-field optics, and this has been actually Eric Betzig's first approach. And I realized that this is the wrong way. This is completely the wrong way because the light doesn't want to go through tiny holes because the light wants to be diffracted. And so so let it diffracted. Let it be diffracted, and then use different ways of separating molecules, not just through the focusing of light. Use and do not separate by photons, separate by states. Yeah, and so that was actually the major, say, lucky moment of my life when I realized, oh, I can break the diffraction barrier just by making the molecules different for a brief period of time. For the time of point of detection, it's different from the rest, namely by having them in different states. Then you don't have to worry about the focusing, yeah, and this is actually the key, and I think this is very hard to beat. So doing it by trying to get a focusing more sharply in the wide field, with focus light, that'll be hard. I don't know how that will be done. So one should never say never, because you never know what's coming up, and physics may bear some, or may have some surprises in store. I don't know, but I don't see how that is done. I don't see that, because so Heisenberg's principle needs to be applied to photons in that case, and I've not seen a violation of that, a serious one at least.
Seems that's a very difficult task. Okay, the next question is also on the technical side, and they ask, the donut-shaped beam would need to have a dark center, which should be very small enough to allow precise localization. How do you actually achieve that?
Yeah, the donut center is actually literally a point, because it's statistically defined by the photons that are surrounding the donut. I mean, the donut is of course a pattern, yeah, but the point where there is no photon showing up is of course very confined. So the 0 point, of course, is if you will, like a singularity. It's extremely well defined, and the more photons you use, of course, for making that donut beam, the better defined in practice will be that point in the center of the donut. And so the good thing is that there is zillions of photons coming from the laser. There's no problem actually. There's no problem actually in defining that 0 point. So that can be defined to angstrom precision, and that's why it's not a big deal. So that's a strength of the method, is that the burden of requiring many photons to define a coordinate is actually placed from the fluorescence emission, from the fluorescence photons, that are always limited and prone to stop, put on the laser, which of course is very reliable and produces zillions of photons in no time. And that's why it's so difficult to define a coordinate with laser light rather than with light that is produced by a fluorescent molecule, which is of course constantly going on and off and bleaching and the rest. And that's the fundamental insight why we get this very, very high precision, because it's done with a laser beam rather than with a fluorescent beam produced by a molecule.
Okay, thank you, Prof. So we have the last on-set question. Please, this gentleman.
Yes, hello, Professor Hell. Thank you for your presentation. So I'm also working with fluorescence microscopy, so I've been following your work for a while already. And I'm wondering, so now that you, let's say, brought the resolution down to the molecular scale and the physics is kind of solved, what are you up to for the next 10 years? I mean, where do you want to go? Is it larger samples, multicolors? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. The answer I gave implicitly, I would say, in the talk, it's the dynamics. This is, you've seen that I spoke about kinesin or so, and why? Because this is the only method that I know of. I really mean it. The only method that I know of that can give, that can measure the dynamics or the movements of molecules, biomolecules, at room temperature with nanometer precision in the millisecond domain. And this may even go up, because the measurements I've shown are just first steps in the field. But this is the way to go when you want to see movements, for example, in cells of proteins, the conformational changes of proteins in cells under physiological conditions. And in my view, this field is likely to turn out to be as important, if not more important, than plain super-resolution fluorescence imaging per se. And this is, in my view, a completely new field. People have not fully appreciated that and realized that, because it always takes some time to realize it. But if I'm thinking here, sitting here at my desk and trying to think, envision the future, so to speak, of the field, in my view, this is going to be a game changer, because there's no other method which allows you to really see how something moves on the nanometer scale, say at the scale of the molecules themselves, the scale of the proteins themselves. With imaging, you can always argue, well, there is EM and cryo-EM, and there is this, and there's atomic force, and so on. But dynamics on that scale, no other method can do that. There's only min-flux and min-stat that could do that right now. And I don't see, because the concept is so strong, I don't see serious competition.
Okay, super. Looking forward. Thank you.
Okay, due to the time constraint, we'll have to stop here. So finally, let's thank Professor Stefan Hell again for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And thank you for your attention and the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof Hell and Prof Liu. We will now take a short 5-minute break before we commence the final plenary lecture. Thank you for coming back on time. Our final speaker is Prof. Alessio Figalli. He's joining us virtually today, and his talk is entitled Optimal Transport Math and Beyond. The Q&A session will be moderated by Prof. Yao Yao. Prof. Figalli, please.
Oh, thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here, even though virtually. So today I would like to talk about optimal transport and beyond, as the math and beyond, as the title says. So it's about optimal transport. I already gave some lectures in the past about this, but today I would really like to focus more on the beyond part. So I will briefly introduce for you the optimal transport problem, how it originated, what mathematicians did at the beginning, but then we will really move rather straight away to applications to show you also some maybe a bit more recent developments on the theory. So the optimal transport problem originated with Gaspard Monge. So we are back during the French Revolution and Napoleonic era. So we talk about 230 years ago now. And essentially, Monge was moved by military applications. So the idea is that you want to do a military campaign, and you will have to build fortifications, let's say across Europe, if you want to do a military campaign in Europe. And you have places, so mines where you extract soil and you start material to build fortifications. And the question is, how do I do it in an efficient way, right? So I have all this material and I want to transport it around, and I want to do it in the cheapest possible way. So here is what my goal is, to do it with a minimal transportation cost. And what do I mean by that? So again, you see this movement of particles that go, and let's say transporting material as a cost. It could be cost because I have to pay for it. It could be cost because people have to do it, even if we don't pay them, but still, like military could do it. But still, it has a cost in terms of value. And so Monge studied this problem. He was focusing really on the military application. In his mind, he said, okay, how much it cost me to transport? Well, the transportation cost for Monge was proportional to the distance, traveled distance. So he thought that a good modeling assumption was that if I have to transport material between two cities, which are, let's say, 100 kilometers apart, and I don't know, I move 1 kilogram of material between two cities, I pay, within two cities which are 100 kilometers apart, I will pay 100. But if the two cities are 1,000 kilometers apart, I will pay 1,000. So I just pay proportional to the transportation, to the distance. And of course, you will pay also proportional to the mass you transport. But let's say at the level of just how much it costs me to move a unit of mass, so 1 kilogram, let's say is my unit of mass, from one place to another, I will just pay proportional to the number of kilometers that this material has traveled. This may look a very simplifying assumption. I mean, perhaps it's not so realistic, but already in this case, there is a lot of very beautiful mathematics that you can do. You can try to understand the geometry of the optimal transport. You can ask yourself, does it exist? An optimal way to do it? If it exists, how it looks like. So Monge actually made a lot of beautiful and remarkable observations that allowed him essentially to fully understand the geometry of the optimal transport problem in 2 and 3 dimensions, which of course are the one physically relevant. Then essentially for 150 years, not much happened until in the 1940s, Leonid Kantorovich, so we have to move from France to Russia now, studied Monge problem, and in a different way. So the idea is that for Monge, you had material in one place and you will just transport it to a different place. So let's say my unit of mass was 1 kilogram. But then once you fix your unit of mass, the idea was that this unit of mass was indivisible. In the mathematical formulation of Monge, Monge was not allowed to say that, okay, I have a kilogram of material and I'm going to send alpha kilogram on one place and alpha kilogram somewhere else. Of course, he could do it if he had 2 kilograms because it was twice the unit of mass. But in a sense, once you block the unit of mass, his mathematical modeling was not flexible enough for him to split masses. And this was a drawback mathematically because of course, it was not allowing him to solve a problem like the one depicted in this picture, right? Because you have maybe bakeries and coffee shops bakeries produce bread, and coffee shops want to buy bread. And so there is a demand, so there is an offer and a demand, right? And your goal is to draw arrows, you see as in this picture, so that in the end, the total transportation cost is the least possible. So this is an economical problem where you see there is no competition. So it's not like I can adjust my price, I can whatever, do competition between bakeries and coffee shops. No, there is no competition. All the goal is cooperation here. We just want to, all the bread that is produced has to go to the different coffee shops, and we want to optimize, have a global optimization problem so that the total transportation cost is the minimal. And so what will happen naturally is that maybe a bakery will bake, I don't know, 4 kilograms of bread, but maybe 2 kilograms will go somewhere, 300 grams will go somewhere else, 500 grams somewhere else, and so on. So you have to split the amount of material you produce into different subunits, which could be arbitrary. And then you just have this optimization problem where these arrows have to beat the demand and the offer. So of course, each coffee shop in the end has to receive all the bread that it needs, and each bakery has to send, let's say, all the bread that produces. Kantorovich, so in that sense, he developed the mathematical theory to study this problem. He transformed the optimal transport problem in a convex optimization problem. So this was something at the theoretical level extremely important, because then even if you wanted to find a numerical solution of optimal transport, you could do it efficiently, because there were, with time, people developed a lot of tools to study convex optimization problems. And in fact, Kantorovich received for this work the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1975. So, the impact of this work has been really remarkable. So this was, let's say, just the beginning. Now, from 1980s on, so in the last 40 years, mathematicians have started really to focus a lot on optimal transport. And by now, there is a lot of mathematical theory on optimal transport, which essentially allows you to say, okay, I have this problem, I have this distribution of material that I want to transport to this configuration. The cost is this one. And I can tell you essentially, yes, there is an optimal transport. No, there is not an optimal transport. More or less how it looks like, and so on. So I will not spend time on this, because in a sense, this is an old story. I just would like to say that what we learned until now is that the choice of the cost plays an important role. So for Monge, the cost was the distance. So this cost between 2 points is just the Euclidean distance. For most of the applications, actually, some I will discuss here, some I will not, but most of the application in general, actually, people realize that one may want to minimize the kinetic energy, actually. So, kinetic energy of a particle is 1/2 velocity square. And then if you think that, velocity time, if you integrate in time, velocity becomes distance, and then you have x minus y square. So x minus y square is just the integral in time of the kinetic energy. So, so that's a very physically relevant choice of the cost. There are more choices, of course, but these are the two, let's say, most classical ones. And now, if you're really interested in the original Monge problem, where he said, I want to transport material between cities, which is a very natural, okay, Monge wanted to transport, to build fortification, but think about just saying, I have goods, and I want to transport goods from one place to another. And what's the cost? Well, the cost should take into account the geometry of the space, right? So for Monge, the cost was just the distance, so number of kilometers. But if there are mountains, if there are valleys, if there are lakes, of course, traveling 100 kilometers can be way more complicated than if I am in a region where everything is flat and there is no geographical obstruction to go from one place to another. So the cost cannot be just the Euclidean distance. You need something a bit more evolved, let's say involved. But by now, I would like to say that all these questions are well understood. So there is a very robust mathematical theory. Now, just to put things in perspective, how broad is optimal transport? Actually, it's extremely broad. So over time, we found a lot of applications. So of course, the most natural application you can have in mind is urban planning. It's the first example I have in my slides. So why urban planning, right? Because planning, urban planning, what does it mean? I want to build a city and I want to do it efficiently in some way. And what could be an optimal transport problem? Well, I know where people live, so I know the distribution of the population, and so where are the houses and the density of population. I know where the offices are, so I know the dense distribution of offices and perhaps across the cities or some locations, whatever. And I want to build infrastructures across the cities so that people can commute in the shortest time. Of course, again, it's a global optimization problem. I don't expect everyone to be happy there, but the total commuting time will be, I can try to make it as minimal as possible. So it's always about global optimization here. There are actually physical examples in meteorology. Meteorology have movement of clouds in there, and clouds move over time, and clouds are made of particles. And what happens in some meteorological models is that you can discover that the way particles inside clouds move is optimal, in the sense that they do it by minimizing some transportation costs. So if I have a cloud and I look at the same cloud 1 second later, the particles will have moved from the first configuration to the second one, and they will have done it optimally. Optimal in the sense of optimal transport. In biology, that's very natural. Biology is optimal again. So if you think about a tree that has to bring nutrients from the ground to the leaves, it does it in a kind of optimal transport way. So there is a transportation effect where you have all these nutrients that go through the roots and then up through the tree and then the branches and so on, and you can find some optimal transport problem to model that. So there are several ways to use optimal transport to model this kind of biological phenomena. Another one which is relevant, and just to mention this, so these other two examples were just to tell you something about image processing that's interesting. So about images, the moment you decide to transport something and you make this a mathematical theory, you can transport everything you want, because mathematics, once you make object abstracts, it doesn't need to be a real object. So you have in mind that we can move objects, we can move, bread and so on. But perhaps one thing that I could do is to say, I have an image, and an image is made of pixels. And maybe I have two images, so two configuration of pixels, and I can ask myself, can I transport the first image to the second image? Which means just transporting pixel from one place to another, perhaps paying a certain cost, depending whether the color of certain pixel is different and so on, right? So I can think of transforming images, or let's say going from one image to another, as a transportation problem, where I have to, move histograms of colors, move pixels and so on. And then I can ask myself, what's the total transportation cost? And if the transportation cost is very little, it means that my two images looks very similar. And if not, otherwise they're not similar. So perhaps if two images are similar, they're representing more or less the same object. Okay, so if you think about image recognition, do you see a car? Do you see a cat? Do you see a dog? What do you see in this image? If you know that two images have low transportation cost, perhaps they're representing the same image. So in image processing, you can think of transport as a tool to compare images. Okay, with this, kind of preliminary considerations, I would like to mention you some recent applications. What else can you do with optimal transport? So these are all examples coming from the last 9 years. So first, GANs. So GANs so these are generative adversarial networks, were introduced a few years ago, and essentially it's like a game that the two computers or neural networks, if you think in terms of machine learning, play between each other. And the goal is the following. So you have in this picture, you have, look at just at the two boxes. There's a G and a D. G is a generator, D is a discriminator. So the generator will be my neural network or whatever. So let's say, think of a computer that is generating images. So this computer has been trained to generate fake images. So what has happened is that this computer has seen a lot of images, let's say, of dogs. And and after seeing billions of them, now he is able to just generate new ones. Okay. On the other hand, you have a discriminator, and the discriminator role is to decide whether an image is a true image or a fake image. So you see there is this kind of in the slides. You see there is the oops, sorry, I moved my mistake. So in the slides you see there is the generator, and on top of the generator there are these real samples. So what you do is that you start to give to the discriminator images. Sometimes they come from the fake images that have been generated by the generator. Sometimes you give him real samples. And then the discriminator every time has to say, oh, this is the real image, this is a fake image. And now what happens is that if the discriminator is correct, you give the feedback to the generator. You say, hey, the generator, you gave a fake image. You gave a fake image to the discriminator. The discriminator realized that this was fake, which means you have not been good enough. You need to improve. So new training is done on the generator to improve. Instead, if the discriminator has been wrong, the feedback is given to it and say, hey, you're not being good enough to discriminate. This was a fake image. You thought it was real. So take this as a new learning lesson for the next situation. So there is this kind of optimization, joint optimization, where they are playing one against each other, but by playing, the feedback that they get from the outcome make them optimize in some sense. This was what GANs are doing. So you need two neural network, two computers in sense, the generator and discriminator. But in sense, what few years later, like in 2017 and then in a later work on 2019, people said, well, I don't need the discriminator. In fact, I just need generator plus fastest end distance. So plus, let's say, a fastest end distance, which means optimal transport. It's just another way to say optimal transport. What do I mean by that? So you generate, so this G theta is like a map that generates, that tells me how to generate images. So I have this bunch of images that are generated. Theta is a parameter that is my optimization parameter, so it's my freedom. I have to choose theta so to make images as good as possible. So I have theta is some object that lives in a very high dimensional space, and I can choose theta. So depending on the theta, I will get different images for each theta. And the goal is that the set of images that I get is as faithful as possible. So in this picture, the measure nu represents the real images. Nu theta represents the fake images generated with parameter theta. And my goal is to optimize theta so that the fake images are as close as possible to the real images in the sense of transportation distance. So in the sense of optimal transport. So you see, you have this huge distribution of real images, this huge distribution of fake images. This huge distribution depends on theta, and then the goal is choose theta as best as possible. So you avoid in this way the double optimization. You only have to optimize in one parameter theta. You don't have to use a discriminator. You can just use optimal transport to understand how good is the approximation. So this is what fastest end GANs are, and they just use, as I say, optimal transport to identify closeness between images, which is why I described this example before. And it's a very nice and useful tool. Just to tell you how good these programs are, just very quickly, these are 3 dogs, and I can tell you that out of these 3 dogs, 2 are fake and only one is real. Which, I don't know, if you just look it quickly, it's rather remarkable. If you look at details, perhaps you can identify which one is the real one. But it's rather remarkable that only one is a real dog and the other 2 are fake. So just to go on, there is another application, for instance, very recent, started in 2019 with Schimminger and his co-authors, about single-cell genomics. So this is a situation where you have cells that evolve over time. So you have to think that, if you take cells, there is always the cells change over time. For instance, that's how tumors grow. And you want to understand the process that guides this differentiation of cells during development. And it's very difficult to do that. So there have been like theoretical models to understand this cell differentiation. And this is called, this is this picture that you see in the background. This is like this landscape, like these cells move through this landscape over time. And you know, perhaps there are valleys and mountains, and then this landscape is what guides the cell differentiation. So this is a model called Waddington landscape model. And what people have done is said, okay, through this model, I can perhaps guess what's going on. Fine. So the landscape, you have to discover what it is. So you know that you predict that there is a landscape. You don't know how it looks like. But the real problem here is the following. You have your bunch of cells, let's say, and you have them at day 1. Then you have them at day 2, and then at day 3, and so on. And then each time you would like to observe them to see what has happened. Did they change? Has there been mutation? So what do you say? You take a bunch of them and you do measurements so to see what happened. But the moment you do measurements, what do? You have a bunch of, let's say, billions of cells, and you take a part of them that you think are representative enough so that they give you enough information, and then you put them in a microscope or whatever to understand what's going on. But the moment you take them out of the living body where they are mutating, then they die. So it means that you cannot really observe the full distribution of cells, because if you observe all of them, you will kill your the body that you're observing. So you're only allowed to take a small sample of them, and you know that every time you take a small sample, this sample is gone from your data set because you killed that cells. This is why you cannot do too many measurements either. You cannot say, oh, I take samples of cells very, very often, and I take a lot of them, because then otherwise you kill everything very quickly. So in a sense, you have little data. That's the problem. You cannot sample too often, and you cannot sample too much. And still you would like to predict what's going on over time. And then what you could think is that you can use optimal transport. So this is what Shibinger and his co-authors called Waddington optimal transport. So combining this landscape model with optimal transport, you could try to identify the trajectories. So you say, okay, at time t1, you see I have this distribution of points, like mu t1 in the picture. Then at time t2, I have these other distribution of points. But how the points from time 1 to time t2 moved from one configuration to the other. So what happened in between? Well, you can think that they have been transported, and they've followed an optimal transport path. So they moved in some optimal transport way. So perhaps close by points have gone to close by points or something like that. So the optimal transport can try to allow you to reconstruct the trajectories. Of course, in all this picture and all these examples, I'm never mentioning what do I mean by optimal transport, in the sense that if you change the cost, the optimal transport changes. So optimal transport is linked to the choice of the cost. And this is another big question, like which cost should you take to reconstruct trajectories? So this is another story. It's not easy. You can try to make guesses. You can try to use artificial intelligence to guess what are reasonable choices and so on. There is a lot of research going on there. But let's say in all these problems, there is a macro problem above everything, which is numerical complexity. So fundamental question, if you want to do anything from an applicative point of view, you have to be able to quickly solve optimal transport. Like, okay, I want to solve the optimal transport problem between two densities. I want to know what is the cost between two densities. I want to do it quickly. I need an answer quickly if I have to do millions of billions of measurements and, a lot of, I have to solve this problem many, many times. Now, if you just use the Kantorovich formulation, the fact that it is a convex optimization problem, and let's say you want to transport n points to n points, then classical theoretical results about convex optimization problem tells you, okay, you can do it in n cube computational cost. So if you have n points, you can do it in n cube. That's too much. If you think about a pixel, the pixel in a picture, I mean, a pixel of the order of millions, and then order of million or 10 million to the cube, and then you have to do this measurement many, many times, is really out of control. So this n cube is way too much. So the question is that, how can I make something better? So here there is a big important point I would like to emphasize. you can try to say, I'm going to find the algorithm which is theoretically the best possible. I want to put this number n cube as low as possible as I can with better algorithms. Or you can say, I want to find an algorithm which from a theoretical viewpoint is not as efficient as others from a theoretical viewpoint, but the moment I put in a computer, actually it works way better than anything else. So here there is always a difference between the best theoretical algorithm and the best practical algorithm. So I would say that at the moment there is a mismatch. In the sense that the ones that people currently use are not the ones that are theoretically clearly more efficient, but in application they're better. Because you always have to think that, from a theoretical viewpoint, you go from n to n cube, what matters is the power. But suppose that I tell you the transportation, how much computational cost I need to do something. And then in one case, I tell you, okay, if you want to compute with this algorithm, you can do it with n cube, but exactly n cube, no constant in front. And then there is another algorithm that it takes n square, but there is a constant in front of n square, which is of the order to, I don't know, 10 to the 20. So 10 to the 20 times n square. Of course, from a computer point of view, this 10 to the 20 kills everything. So even if you have a better power, the constant in front matters. So there is always this mismatch between theory and application. It's also always a matter of, okay, is it really, it's not only the power, I need also the constant in front, okay? Now, there are many algorithms, but I will say one of remarkable idea that was introduced by Couturi and then developed by Couturi and Perret is entropic regularization. This crucially improves computational cost. You can very efficiently compute optimal transport at the expense of a small error, okay? So they don't compute exactly optimal transport, they compute what they call entropic optimal transport. It's optimal transport up to some epsilon error. Epsilon is the regularization strength. So it's like saying I have my measures mu and nu, and solving optimal transport would be like finding a line in this square, which is telling you how points move. This is like this line represents the graph of the optimal transport, but doesn't matter. Let's say that optimal transport is like finding a line, and then in the entropic regularization, I don't find a line, I find some blurry version of it. Okay, fine. That's good enough for most applications. Even if it's a bit blurry, I can compute many things. That's the very vague idea. Now, to conclude, I would like to mention a couple of more things. So there have been applications, digital question like neural networks and gradient flow. So for instance, neural networks. What is a neural network? Like there is a very simple case, which is single layer neural network. So you have inputs, so you have data that kick in your first layer. Then some operations happens in between two layers, and then you get an output. And then the operation that happens in between are just very simple operations, just some linear transformation, well, affine transformation, let's say, between one layer and another. And the goal of in training a neural network is to find numbers θ1 to θn that tells you how strong is the connection between two neurons. You have to think this like as a brain. Neurons are connected between one layer and another, and θn represents the intensity of the connection between different neurons. And then you ask, I want to choose θn, this θ in the most efficient way. So you can think of this as a huge string of numbers, or you can build a probability measures out of it, which is just sum of Dirac deltas at θi normalized by 1 over n. And if you take this interpretation, so not of string of numbers, but probability measures, then you can use, optical transport is about transporting densities, so about transporting perhaps also probability measures. So optical transport is very efficient to tell you how to make probability measures move and evolve in time. So the training of a single layer neural network can be reinterpreted as a gradient flow in some optimal transport sense. Just for completeness, I give you like the vague formula that this is like the evolution equation that this measure has to satisfy to train your neural network. And these kind of formulas are very common in optimal transport. Unfortunately, this interpretation is true only for single layer neural network. So if you have a shallow neural network, it works. If you have deep neural networks, there is nothing like that. But I would just like to conclude with something else, which is a bit more recent. So I told you before, many problems, like for instance, Wasserstein-Gunn, corresponds to minimize some transportation cost. So you have probability measures, mu theta, which are indexed by this parameter theta. Theta is a very large dimensional parameter. You have a fixed measure mu, and then what you want to do is to minimize, with respect to theta, the transportation cost between mu theta and nu. So you have to choose the theta so that mu theta is the closest as possible to nu. How do you do that? So how do you find this theta? This is challenging because this problem, as a minimization problem in theta, is not convex. So what happens when you minimize a non-convex problem is that you have many critical points, okay? So if you have a convex function and you try to find the minimum, there is a unique minimum, and this is the only point where the gradient of your function is 0. So there is only one critical point for a convex function, which is the set of minima. But for a non-convex function, there may be many local minima. There could be many critical points, and that makes this minimization challenging. How do I find this minimum? So what people do to find a minimum is run a gradient flow of the energy. Okay, so you have the energy, you start from some configuration, so you fix theta 0 times 0, and then you start to evolve theta in time, try to go down in the energy, and try to find the best possible theta. I will show you in a video in a second what I mean. And there is a critical idea that if you get stuck in this gradient flow, you will get stuck. Essentially, what happens? A gradient flow is looking at the is moving along the direction of the gradient of your energy. So gradient flows get stuck every time you are at a critical point. So if you start at a critical point, which is perhaps not a minimum, you don't move. But if generically, if I just start from a random configuration and then move, I will never get stuck to a critical point which is not stable, because unstable critical points are points where I run away from. So let me try to explain this with a video. So I would like to discuss this. So this is a video from Marc Pelletier. So look at this. I will stop it a second for you first. You see there are two balls in this picture. So these are two initial configurations for your gradient flow. One ball starts from, the ball starts on top of two local mountains, let's say. You see where the minimum is this blue deep area. And technically you would like to go there, right? So what do? You take some initial configuration, that bit random, and then you start to move down, right? And you follow the gradient flow. So what you do is that you move along the direction where the landscape of your energy is going down. So you have to think that your energy, you can plot your energy functional. You start at some configuration where you have some certain energy, and then you look where you are in this landscape, and then you start to move in the direction where the energy is going down. This is how you will go down from a mountain yourself. And so you start, you see you have two options, perhaps, or more. And then you see the balls on the top are moving, and on the top they're falling down to the right, and there are others where and they get stuck. And then other balls, in fact, they go down and they reach the minimum. Okay? And here they are. So you see that depending where you start, you may get stuck in two different places. But in both cases here, they are critical. So in one case, it's the full minimum. The other case, the one to the right, you didn't get stuck at a minimum. The energy is rather high there still. But despite the energy being high, you see this is a local minimum. The shape is like the one of a valley. You are in a region where you don't get out. You don't get stuck in general on a saddle point. So you don't get stuck in a situation where it's very easy to fall down. So the critical theoretical idea here is like, if you get stuck at a critical point, this critical point has to be stable, because at an unstable critical point, you have zero probability to get stuck there, okay? And this is like the critical idea that we try to exploit in our research. So given that the idea is that points where the gradient flow could get stuck are stable, then maybe we can say something about stable critical points. So not in general. Of course, in general, there is no reason. Like the picture I gave you before, there was a stable critical point which had a huge energy compared to the minimum. But perhaps in this particular configuration, where you are minimizing optimal transport cost with respect to some training problem, blah, blah, blah. So in this particular optimal transport minimization problem, perhaps we can prove that stable critical points are very nice. In fact, all stable critical points are nice. They look almost like minima. They're not minima, but they look very similar. And perhaps you can prove that every stable critical point has an energy which is not that far from the optimum. That was the idea of our research. In fact, we could prove it very recently, still a work in progress with Quentin Merigot and Filippo Sant'Ambrogio, that if you study the quantization problem, so if this minimum over theta of vast and C mu theta nu represent some kind of quantization problem, then in fact, stable critical points do look similar to minima. And this is false for non-stable critical points. So you find unstable critical points which are very, very far from minima. And this explains why algorithms work so well. This explains why even if you put these kind of problems in a computer, in reality, they just converge super nicely despite being non-convex. Because in reality, you never get stuck. And you only get stuck at configuration which are almost minimum. Okay, I think I took all the time I had, or probably even a bit more. So I would like to stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Prof. Figalli. We now invite Prof. Yao to moderate the Q&A.
Thank you, Professor Figalli, for the fascinating talk. Is there any questions from the audience? The gentleman over there, please.
Thanks for the talk, Professor. I have a quick question about what you think about learning and optimal transport. So people have been using learning methods. I mean, people have been posing optimization problems as learning problems ever since learning got popular. And they do end up with solution, but it's mostly, at the end of the day, the problem can be solved with traditional solvers, and you can get the exact optimal solution using excision solvers, right? So do you see a future where learning methods are going to be useful just beyond, let's say, heuristic development? Thank you.
Sorry, can you just repeat the last
part? Are learning methods going to be useful anywhere just beyond, let's say, heuristic design for optimization problems? So, like, are they going to be useful in, let's say, you coming up with new theoretical solutions or new algorithmic design to get exact solutions? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a very good point, right? I mean, yes, I think this is the goal, right? I mean, in the end, that's the long-term goal, but it's always between theoretical and computational solution, there is always a big gap, I would say. And I mean, just, I think this last result that I showed is like an example. I mean, I think, so the reason why we did, for instance, this kind of idea of looking at stable critical points and try to motivate that they're nicer than others came because we saw that some algorithms that people were doing were working very well. So I would say that, you know, there are many things here in this that one can think out of this, right? On one hand, I think this is nice because it says that very often what you see in algorithms can motivate new theoretical results that then perhaps can justify what you see in algorithms and perhaps allow you to improve stuff. Here in optimal transport, it works rather well in some situation. Maybe one warning point that I would always like to make is that, you know, people ask me, okay, does it mean that I should use always optimal transport? I don't think that's true. I think that there are situations where it works better than other approaches, more classical, and there are many situations where it doesn't work better, and then one should just stick to what people already use. So it's not like this is the, you know, the graal of all problems, and then you can just use that and it will work. I think it's just, you know, in some cases it works, some others doesn't. But that's also how mathematics and general research works. I mean, there is no simple solution for everything, which is also why things are interesting, perhaps.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can then move to the lady over there.
Hi, Professor Figalli. Thank you for your talk.
Hello.
My name is Akshaya, and I'm a PhD student from the University of Illinois. I had a more general question about research in theory. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts or some advice for us researchers in theory about how to keep motivation up where progress in terms of positive results is quite non-linear. We are just thinking about a problem for so long and then finally things fall into place. So, and when it doesn't happen for a long time, it can be quite demotivating. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Oh, sure. Well, I think that goes a bit beyond the talk, of course, but I'm happy to give a quick answer. So I think that's a part of the process that we all face as researchers. We are all in the same boat. The time where we get stuck on a problem is way longer than the one where we solve the problem, because, you know, the solution usually gets quickly and then the frustration time is very long. So one has to find ways to cope with that. My advice is, first of all, we all struggle, so don't take it personal. It's not that you're not good. It's like that. It's just that problems are difficult, and that's how research progresses, because we try to face challenging problems. It's good sometimes to have something on the side, some other extra problems to work parallelly, especially if you get stuck for long and you need to clear out your brain. So you say, okay, now I'm really stuck on this. There is, I don't know, I'm not making progress. It doesn't make sense to hit that over and over after so much time. Let me take a break. Let me try something else. And perhaps I come back to this. This kind of, as much as possible, depends, of course, on the area of research, depends what you're doing. But in general, the fact of clearing the air, then try to do something different, go to something different problem, also work with collaborators with whom you can share your frustrations and empathize, that helps a lot, I think. I mean, for most of, I solved many problems in my career, but I have more problems that I couldn't solve than problems that I could solve. So that's a fact. And also when I solve them, I mean, there has never been a linear process. Usually you try, you get stuck, you give up. I gave up for problems over for like a year and a half, and then I will go back again, try again, different approach, not working, leave again. And perhaps after 5, 6, 7 years, I could come up with the right solution. But it's also been lucky, because you need the right idea at the right moment. So it's a very tough thing. Probably is not discussed enough, because probably we always have our pride and we don't want to share our weaknesses. But there is nothing wrong with that. It's just normal. And I think it's good to have collaborators, and it's good also to not get too obsessed sometimes. A bit of obsession is necessary, but over obsession is not good. Perhaps it's good to take breaks on here and there when possible. That would be my quick tip.
Thank you. Okay, maybe we can take 2 more questions from the live audience. So let's start from this gentleman, and then we will move on there.
Hi, sorry, my question's also not about optimal transport. So I'm a biologist, and I don't pretend to understand fully what you're working on, but it's very interesting to see your mathematical modeling of the biological phenomenon that you showed. So unlike physics and chemistry, biology is one of those fields where we don't really have a lot of mathematical models to explain phenomena. And some physicists look down on biology as less of a science because of that, which I mean, probably is fair. So my question is it like that biology is just inherently so complex that it's hard to mathematize, or is it that there's been lack of an effort from both sides? Thank you.
I think biology is extremely complex, of course, and you know, the farther you go, the more it's difficult sometimes to find a common ground to understand what's going on, right? So more and more now you see people, mathematicians with background in biology that do really math biology, and there is more and more communication. But this is more of a recent phenomenon in the last, I would say, 20 years. Definitely, biology, is super complex. I mean, even from a practical viewpoint, you cannot really explain what's going on, right? Very often you have difficulties just you see evidences, but in some sense you don't know why this tumor developed, you don't know exactly what happened. And so you see that there are 2 layers, right? There is what's going on, and then how you model that. And so this complexity is one of the main challenges. So I think that's why I think that we struggle a lot. But the one good thing is that technology is gonna help us more and more, because, for instance, I was telling you, for instance, if you want to use optimal transport to model this kind of cell genomics, then the question is, which cost do I use? And if just you ask someone which cost do I use, I have no clue which cost you should use, and you would just try, I don't know, 5 random different costs and try something. Now what people have started to do is to use artificial intelligence, neural networks to model cost as well. So you use a neural network not only to model what's going on, but also you can put a family of cost inside the neural network. And then in the training process, you can train the cost itself. So now I think technology is going in a moment where it can help us to predict or to guess better what's going on, because in reality there is no obvious theoretical way to just say, oh yeah, this is the equation behind it, and this is why it's working this way. That is that we don't know. I mean, it's too complex. So I think it will just take more time. And also, you know, for this, you also have to think, right? For physics, you could develop theories back, even Newton. You didn't need much instruments, right, to do that. But biology, I mean, you need, it's something where we could make process only recently in some sense, because the technology that you need, the lab, all the experiments that you do are, they were way more difficult to do in the past. So
do you see it getting to a point where, do you see it getting to a point where we won't get criticized by physicists?
Oh, but that's fine. I mean, I think like, you know, it's like within mathematics, you know, pure mathematicians say applied mathematicians are not the same, and then applied mathematicians look maybe on top or look from above to a physicist and so on. I mean, that's just how scientists be, but you shouldn't just care about that. I mean, that's fine. There is nothing wrong about that.
Okay, thank you, Professor Figalli. So due to the time constraint, I'm afraid that we have to wrap up the Q&A session. Thank you, Professor Figalli, again for the wonderful talk, and thank you everyone for coming.
Dear online participants, thank you once again for joining us. I'm now pleased to announce the winners of the GYSS 2023 video contest. We thank everyone for your creative and engaging submissions, and for your generous sharing of your research with the community. The winners from last year are now with us here in Singapore, and would like to award this opportunity to the following winners.
Lightning. It's a plasma, the fourth state of matter. Plasmas can form when electricity flows through a gas, turning molecules into charged ions. In our lab, we use a plasma to turn gas molecules into ions so that we can detect them with a mass spectrometer.
My science journey is to help the primary and resistant hypertension patients by identifying a novel drug molecule that reduces the blood pressure via an entirely new pathway. However, the journey for drug from lab to market is not easy.
Congratulations once again to all winners, and we look forward to you joining us next year. To the rest of you, thank you once again for your enthusiasm. This marks the end of GYSS Summit, and we hope you had a good time. Here's wishing all of you good health and a great start to 2023.